Chapter 1. A Star is Born. The winds howled through the northern hills of Macedonia on a night that would live in legend. The town of Pella lay beneath dark clouds, its stone streets slick with rain. Within the palace, torches flickered along, marble corridors, their flames bending to an unseen force in the air. Servants hurried in silence, carrying bowls of water, cloth, and herbs. In the royal chamber, Queen Olympias labored to bring forth a child, one whom fate seemed eager to receive. Outside, the storm did not relent. Yet high above the swirling clouds, a fiery streak tore across the sky. A comet, bright and sudden, igniting whispers across the land. At that same moment, a message arrived at the palace gates. The Macedonian army had triumphed in battle. Another rider brought news of Philip's prize horse winning at the Olympic Games. Victory, both in the heavens and on the earth, seemed to herald the child's arrival. Then, as thunder cracked across the mountains, Alexander was born. His first cry was said to echo through the stone halls like a clarion call. His mother, breathless but fierce, gazed upon him and whispered words few would dare utter. "You are the child of Zeus." Word of these signs spread quickly. In a land where omens were not dismissed, the people believed this boy had arrived beneath a rare alignment of fortune. Astrologers studied the heavens with wide eyes. Priests spoke of ancient prophecies now, stirred from their long sleep. Though no crown yet rested on his brow, Alexander entered the world as more than a prince. He was a figure wrapped in the folds of destiny. King Philip returned from campaign to find both victory and heir waiting. For him, stern and pragmatic, he observed the comet's trail, listened to the priest's reports, and, though a warrior of reason, felt a strange certainty settle within him. The child born this night would not remain bound by Macedonia's borders. The world, vast and wild, awaited his tread. So began the life of the boy they called the Thunder Child, born amid fire and storm, destined to chase the horizons that others dared not dream. Roots of a king. Alexander's early days were shaped by forces as different as the two people who gave him life. His father, King Philip II of Macedonia, was a man of ambition and steel, a military genius who had transformed Macedonia from a fractured land of feuding clans into a rising power. Philip's rule was marked by conquest, reform, and relentless drive. He believed in the sword and the shield, in strategy and order. His queen, Olympias, was cut from another cloth entirely. Born a princess of Epirus, she brought to the Macedonian court a deep devotion to the old gods and ancient rites. She worshipped Dionysus and followed mystical practices that unnerved Philip's more practical court. Her belief that her son was fathered not by Philip but by Zeus himself was more than vanity. It was a conviction she wove into Alexander's upbringing. Their union was one of fire and stone. Sparks flew often in the halls of Pella. Yet from their turbulent bond arose a boy shaped by both the hardness of a soldier and the vision of a seer. Philip saw in Alexander a future king, and so from an early age the boy was trained in the ways of leadership. Tutors instructed him in history, governance, and language. Soldiers taught him to ride and fight. From his father, Alexander learned discipline, courage, and the harsh truths of power. But in the quiet hours away from court, it was Olympias who shaped his soul. She told him tales of heroes and gods, of Achilles on the plains of Troy and Heracles, labors. She spoke often of Alexander's divine bloodline, urging him to believe that his destiny was written in the stars, not just in the laws of men. This dual inheritance would define him. The iron will of Philip gave Alexander the tools to command. The soaring vision of Olympias instilled in him the belief that no summit was beyond his reach. From these roots grew a prince whose gaze would one day stretch beyond the known world. Whispers from Olympus. As Alexander grew, so too did the stories that surrounded him. Olympias ensured that her son was steeped in a world where the line between mortal and divine was thin. Within the marble halls of Pella, beneath murals of gods and heroes, she whispered to him that greatness was his birthright, not because he was Philip's heir, but because he was of Olympian blood. She told him of the night of his birth, of the comet blazing in the sky, of the victories that marked his arrival. She described visions she claimed to have seen, Zeus in the form of a serpent visiting her chamber beneath the light of the moon. These tales were not merely bedtime stories, they were the framework of Alexander's identity. From his earliest days, Alexander believed himself to be destined for more than kingship. He was told again and again that he was born to reshape the world, to achieve deeds that would be sung long after he was gone. And in this belief, a fire was kindled within him, a restless hunger that no mere throne could satisfy. Yet the boy did not grow arrogant. Rather, he became deeply curious about the world and his place within it. He questioned the priests, debated with scholars, and sought wisdom from all who crossed his path. His education under the great philosopher Aristotle would later deepen this quest, but even in childhood, the seeds of insatiable learning had already been planted. In the quiet of the palace gardens, under starlit skies, Alexander would often stare upward, pondering the stories of the gods. Were they truly his kin? Could he surpass the deeds of Achilles and Heracles? The whispers from Olympus were not chains, they were wings, and with each passing year, they carried his dreams higher. As he approached boyhood's end, those closest to him saw a prince who carried himself with an unusual grace, a seriousness beyond his years, a gaze that seemed fixed on some far horizon. Within Alexander stirred a force shaped by myth and tempered by discipline. The world had not yet met him, but the winds of fate already gathered at his back. The boy in the marble halls. Life within the palace of Pella was a tapestry woven with beauty and tension. Its marble halls echoed with the footsteps of envoys, generals, and courtiers. Columns rose like silent sentinels, their surfaces etched with scenes from Macedonia's past. Amid this splendor moved the young Alexander, a boy keenly aware of the undercurrents flowing beneath the polished surface of royal life. From his earliest days, Alexander learned that power was both gift and burden. He watched as alliances were forged and broken, as flattery masked ambition. He saw how the nobles eyed his father's throne and whispered in shadowed alcoves. Through it all, he listened, absorbing the lessons that no tutor could teach. At court, he observed his father's mastery of politics and war. He saw how Philip's sharp mind and commanding presence bent others to his will. Yet he also saw the price of such mastery, the endless vigilance, the loneliness of leadership. These lessons imprinted themselves deeply upon him. But there was more to Alexander's world than courtly games. The palace was also a place of learning. Its libraries held scrolls from distant lands. Its chambers rang with the voices of philosophers and poets. Here, Alexander's mind found fertile ground. He devoured tales of exploration and conquest, history and legend. His favorite was the story of Achilles, warrior of Troy, unmatched in battle, yet forever seeking meaning beyond the blade. In the gardens, beneath cypress and olive, Alexander practiced both body and mind. He trained with sword and spear, rode horses with fearless grace, and engaged in long discussions with visiting scholars. Even then, there was a quiet intensity about him, a sense that each lesson was but a stepping stone towards some greater purpose. At night, when the palace grew still, Alexander would wander its echoing halls. Beneath the gaze of marble statues, he pondered the voices that seemed to call from beyond time. Were they echoes of the gods, or the stirrings of his own boundless ambition? Though still a boy, Alexander's heart already beat to a different rhythm. He did not dream of ruling Macedonia alone. The stars whispered of larger realms, of lands beyond the sea, of a name that would one day echo across the ages. In the silence of the palace, beneath stone and starlight, a conqueror was awakening, and so ended the first chapter of a life that would reshape the world. A child born beneath signs of wonder, raised between myth and steel, listening to the ancient call of destiny. Chapter 2: The Taming of Bucephalus. The sun hung high over the courtyard of the Macedonian palace, casting long beams of golden light across its pale stone floor. Heat shimmered in the air, but the crowd of courtiers, soldiers and grooms stood, transfixed by something far more fierce than the summer sun. A magnificent black horse that refused to be tamed. The creature reared and stamped, its powerful hooves striking the ground with thunderous force. Muscles rippled beneath its dark coat, and foam lathered at its mouth. Its eyes flashed with a wild light, filled with panic and defiance. One after another, the kingdom's finest riders had tried to mount it. One after another, they had been thrown aside like leaves in the wind. The great King Philip stood to one side, arms crossed, his gaze sharp. He had paid a fortune for this horse, Bucephalus, named for its ox-like head and rumoured descent from noble stock in Thessaly. The animal's strength was unmatched, but so was its terror. Now the courtiers whispered that the king had been cheated, that the beast was too wild to ever serve in battle. Nearby, a slender boy no more than 12 watched in silence. His hair was sunlit gold, his eyes keen with a wisdom beyond his years. This was Alexander. While others jeered or mocked, he remained still, studying the scene with a gaze as steady as the mountain peaks. He saw more than muscle and fury. He saw the twitch of the horse's ears, the darting of its eyes, the shudder of its flanks. This was not madness, he thought. This was fear. Another warrior approached the horse with force, whip in hand. Bucephalus reared higher, teeth bared. With a scream of frustration, the rider stumbled away, defeated. Philip shook his head and gave the order. "Enough! Take the animal away." But as the grooms moved forward, Alexander stepped from the crowd. His voice was clear and calm. "Father, do not waste this horse. I can tame him." Laughter rippled through the court. A boy? Against a beast that had humbled grown men. But Philip, though surprised, did not mock his son. Instead, he watched, curious to see what the boy would do. Alexander's heart pounded, but his face showed no fear. Step by step, he approached the great black horse, slowly, steadily. The crowd fell silent. Even Bucephalus seemed momentarily puzzled by this small figure advancing without whip or rope. The boy stopped a few paces away and waited. He made no sudden move, no harsh command. Instead, he let the horse see him, let it breathe and settle. A bond of trust, fragile as a thread, began to weave between them. The courtyard, moments before a stage of noise and struggle, now held its breath. Facing the sun, Alexander's eyes remained locked on Bucephalus. His mind raced through what he had observed. Again and again, the horse had shied from its own shadow, rearing violently when it caught sight of the dark shape beneath its feet. Fear, not fury, ruled this creature. Fear born of confusion and of the unknown. Slowly he spoke, not to the crowd, but to the horse itself. Soft words, meant to soothe rather than command. Then, with careful movements, he took hold of the reins. Instead of forcing the horse downward or trying to wrestle its head, Alexander began to guide it gently in a slow arc, turning its gaze away, from the ground and toward the open sky. With each small step, he led Bucephalus until they faced directly into the sun. Now, with the light blinding the ground beneath, the horse could no longer see the shadow that had haunted it. The tension in its body began to ease. The great head lowered slightly. Its breath slowed. And still, Alexander did not rush. He placed a steady hand upon the animal's neck, feeling the tremble beneath the skin. Then, with a grace born of patience, he mounted. For a moment, the horse stiffened. Muscles quivered. But the boy remained calm, his touch light and sure. The connection held. Then, like the sudden break of a storm, Bucephalus surged forward, not in panic, but in release. Hooves pounded the earth as Alexander guided the black steed in a wide circle across the courtyard. Gasps rose from the watching crowd. Where seasoned warriors had failed, the boy rode as though born to the saddle. Horse and rider moved as one, each motion in perfect harmony. Sweat gleamed upon Alexander's brow, but his expression was serene. He had faced the storm within the beast, not with force, but with understanding. And in doing so, he had earned its trust. When at last he drew Bucephalus to a graceful halt, the courtyard erupted in cheers. Even the seasoned veterans among Philip's men applauded, their laughter now replaced with awe. Alexander dismounted, stroking the horse's flank with gentle pride. In that moment, beneath the sun's golden gaze, a bond had been forged. One that would endure through trials yet unseen. Philip's pride. King Philip stepped forward, his face a mixture of astonishment and deep pride. He regarded his son not merely as a boy, but as a figure transformed before his eyes. In a voice thick with emotion, he spoke words that would echo in Alexander's heart for years to come. "My son, seek a kingdom worthy of you, for Macedonia is too small." These were no idle words. Philip had long dreamed of a greater realm, a vision of Greek unity and beyond. But in this moment, he glimpsed a truth even larger. Alexander was destined not to follow his footsteps, but to surpass them. The court, sensing the depth of this moment, fell silent once more. Fathers watched their sons with new thoughts in their minds. Soldiers eyed the boy with newfound respect. For Alexander, these words from his father were both a gift and a challenge. In taming Bucephalus, he had tasted the thrill of mastery, not over a creature, but over fear itself. He had learned that power was not brute force alone, but the wisdom to see what others could not. In the days that followed, Alexander and Bucephalus became inseparable. The black stallion would bear him across countless fields and battle lines, from the hills of Macedonia to the rivers of the Far East. Together, they would ride at the heart of legends yet unwritten. But even then, in the quiet, moments after the cheers had faded, the boy prince understood that this was but the beginning. The world beyond Pella called to him. His father's words had opened a door, and Alexander, even as a boy, was eager to step through it. The first crown, with Bucephalus beneath him, Alexander gained more than a horse. He earned his first true lesson in leadership. For it was not strength alone that had won the day. It was insight, patience, and a willingness to understand the heart of another. True power, he now saw, begins not with the sword, but with the mind. The greatest leaders are those who see beyond the surface, who speak to the fears and hopes that drive others. In that sunlit courtyard, amidst stone and sky, a boy had taken his first step toward becoming a king. As days turned to weeks, Alexander continued to train, not only in the arts of war, but in philosophy, history, and the stories of lands beyond the sea. Under the guidance of wise tutors, including the great Aristotle, he sharpened both mind and spirit. Yet the bond with Bucephalus remained a constant thread, a living symbol of what understanding could achieve. Often, in the cool of dawn, Alexander would ride out alone upon the black steed, galloping across the fields beyond the palace walls. The wind in his hair, the earth rushing beneath, he would dream of horizons yet unseen. He knew that life within the palace, though rich and secure, was but a narrow stage. The true theatre of destiny lay beyond the mountains, beyond the seas, in lands whose names stirred the blood. And in the steady rhythm of Bucephalus's stride, Alexander heard the pulse of that wider world, a world he would one day claim not for conquest alone, but for the chance to shape it with wisdom and vision. Thus did a boy and a horse set forth upon the first path of legend. Not in a blaze of war, but in the quiet triumph of understanding, and the story of Alexander the Great, though still in its earliest pages, was already gathering the force of a tale that would echo through the ages. Chapter 3: The Philosopher and the Prince. The sun rose softly over the hills of Mysa, a quiet town nestled in the heart of Macedonia. Here, away from the noise of court and the clang of arms, a grove of ancient trees offered cool shade and silence. Beneath their branches, a boy sat cross-legged upon the earth. Before him stood a man with eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages. This man was Aristotle. Alexander, just 13, had been sent here by his father, King Philip. Not to wield a sword, he had already shown skill in that, but to shape his mind. For a prince who would one day command armies, Philip knew that strength alone would never be enough. The mind must be sharpened as surely as the blade. And so, beneath the green canopy of Mysa, a new chapter began. Here there were no soldiers shouting orders, no court intrigue to untangle, only the quiet rhythm of learning. Aristotle's voice flowed with calm authority, weaving lessons that spanned the heavens and the earth. He taught Alexander not just logic and reason, but how to see the world with clear eyes. The stars were not mere lights in the sky. They were distant suns, bound by unseen laws. Plants, animals, and stones each held secrets waiting to be uncovered. Every question led to another, and no answer was beyond reach. Yet Aristotle also spoke of things unseen, the nature of justice, the meaning of friendship, the pursuit of virtue. He taught that a ruler must not only conquer, but lead with wisdom. That power used without thought was a danger to all. Alexander listened, absorbed, and questioned. His mind was as hungry as his heart was bold. Where other boys might have grown restless, he found wonder in each new idea. The grove of Mysa became his second home, a garden of thought where seeds of vision were planted deep within him. Each day, beneath those ancient trees, the Prince of Macedonia was transformed, not by force, but by the power of knowledge. And in time, these quiet lessons would shape a leader who would dream beyond the borders of the known world. The dagger and the Iliad. Even as his mind expanded beneath Aristotle's guidance, Alexander remained a warrior at heart. He carried this dual nature, thinker and fighter, like two sides of the same coin. At night, when lessons were done and the stars wheeled overhead, Alexander returned to his simple chamber. There, beside his bed, he kept two objects close. Under his pillow lay a dagger, sharp, gleaming, ready, and beside it, a worn copy of Homer's Iliad. This was no ordinary book. It had been given to him by his tutor, marked with passages chosen, for a young prince who sought both wisdom and courage. To Alexander, the Iliad was more than a tale of war. It was a mirror of the life he longed to live. By the flicker of a single lamp, he would read of Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, of honor and rage, of love and loss. The poetry of Homer spoke to the deepest parts of his soul. Here was a hero not unlike himself, gifted, restless, driven to seek glory beyond mortal grasp. Yet even as he admired Achilles, Alexander learned from his faults. The tales of pride and its cost, of the bonds between men, left their mark upon him. The dagger beneath his pillow reminded him that the path of the warrior was ever present, but the Iliad whispered that the greatest victories were those tempered by understanding. In this nightly ritual, steel and story met, and in the heart of a young prince, the foundations of character were laid. He would be a fighter, yes, but one who thought deeply about the meaning of each battle. He would seek not only conquest, but a legacy worthy of song. Thus, beneath the stars of Mieza, Alexander prepared for a life both fierce and thoughtful, shaped as much by the words of a poet as by the edge of a blade. The world beyond borders. As the seasons passed beneath the green canopy of Mieza, Aristotle's lessons grew ever wider. No subject was too great, no mystery too small. The universe itself became the classroom. Together, teacher and pupil explored the dance of the stars, the cycles of the moon, the vastness of the heavens. Alexander learned that the world was far, larger than the lands known to his people. Beyond the mountains and seas lay kingdoms and cultures yet unseen. Each one was a piece of a great puzzle, a puzzle he longed to complete. From the sky, their studies turned to the earth. They spoke of distant lands, Persia, Egypt, India, of the animals that roamed their forests and deserts, of the rivers that carved paths through continents. Aristotle taught that to lead, one must first understand the world in all its forms. Alexander listened with rapt attention. Maps filled his dreams. The idea of borders began to seem small, almost foolish. Why should a river or a wall define the limits of a man's reach? Why should knowledge or rule be bound by such lines? He began to see himself not merely as a Macedonian prince, but as a citizen of the wider world. The names of foreign kings and lands became familiar. He studied their strengths and weaknesses, their beliefs and customs. Where others might have viewed them as enemies, Alexander saw opportunities for connection or conquest. Even in matters of nature, his curiosity had no end. He learned of plants that healed and poisons that killed, of creatures large and small, their habits and habitats. Knowledge became another form of power, one as vital as the sword. In these lessons, Alexander's vision grew. He began to dream of a realm where East and West met, where wisdom and culture flowed freely. He imagined a world not divided by fear, but united by understanding. The prince beneath the trees of Mieza was no longer content with the crown of Macedonia alone. In his heart, new ambitions stirred, ambitions as vast as the world itself, seeds of empire. The years at Mieza passed swiftly. In the quiet groves, beneath the careful guidance of Aristotle, a boy had grown into a young man, one whose thoughts reached far beyond the borders of his birth. Though the lessons would one day end, they were not forgotten. When the call of duty summoned Alexander back to the court of Pella, he carried Mysa within him. The grove, the stars, the scrolls, all had shaped his view of the world. He returned to a palace where politics and ambition swirled like storms. His father's conquests were growing, and Alexander now stood poised to claim his place in a world on the brink of change. Yet even as he trained with spear and sword, as he learned the art of leading men, the deeper lessons of Mysa remained close. He had seen that power without wisdom was hollow, that a true leader must inspire, not merely command. That understanding the world was the first step to shaping it. In his heart, the seeds of empire had taken root, not a mere thirst for conquest, but a vision of something greater, a realm where knowledge crossed borders, where culture and learning thrived alongside strength. When at last Alexander would set forth to carve his name upon the world, these lessons would guide his hand. For the boy who had once listened beneath, the trees had become a man whose dreams reached to the ends of the earth. And though the groves of Mysa would fade behind him, their wisdom would ride beside him, ever present, ever true. Chapter 4: Rise of the Regent. The morning light crept softly over the marble columns of Pella. The palace, usually humming with voices and movement, seemed to hold its breath. A shift had come to Macedonia. King Philip had ridden off to war, leaving behind a young regent to rule in his stead. That regent was his 16-year-old son, Alexander. The weight of the crown was not yet his, but the burden of command now rested on his shoulders. Within the great halls of the court, advisors whispered behind closed doors. Some doubted the wisdom of entrusting such power to one so young. Others wondered if this was their chance to steer the kingdom for their own gain. Alexander heard these whispers. He saw the sideways glances, yet he remained still, his gaze steady. The years beneath Aristotle's guidance had shaped his mind. The lessons of the battlefield, learned at his father's side, had steeled his resolve. Now both mind and will were called upon in full. Outside the palace walls, the land stirred with unrest. News reached Pella that a northern tribe had rebelled, seizing a key region along the border. Word spread that they believed the boy regent would hesitate, that Macedonia's strength had left with its king. But Alexander did not hesitate. The blood of Philip ran in his veins, and the dreams of empire burned in his heart. Macedonia would not fall, not now, not ever, not while he stood in its defense. Summoning the council, he spoke with calm authority. Orders were given. Troops were readied. The prince would not remain within marble walls while enemies rose. He would ride at the head of his army. And so, beneath a sky of gathering clouds, Alexander prepared for his first true campaign, not as a student or a prince, but as a general who would be tested by fire. The throne might be his for a time, but his resolve would prove whether he was worthy of it. Sword and strategy. The march north was swift. Alexander rode at the front, clad in simple armor, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The soldiers, many of them veterans who had served under Philip, watched the young regent closely. Would he falter when faced with the harsh realities of war? They did not have to wait long for their answer. As the army neared the rebellious stronghold, Alexander called his commanders to council. Maps were unrolled upon a rough-hewn table. The terrain was studied, the enemy's movements traced. The prince spoke with clarity, outlining a plan of swift assault and precise maneuver. There would be no drawn-out siege, no waiting for the rebels to strengthen their hold. At dawn, under a pale and rising sun, the attack began. Alexander led the charge himself. Sword in hand, he rode into the fray with fearless determination. His presence at the front inspired the men, driving them forward with renewed vigor. Where others might have sought the safety of command from the rear, Alexander believed that leadership was earned upon the field, side by side with those who fought. The battle was fierce, but brief. The rebels, unprepared for the prince's bold assault, soon broke and fled. Victory belonged to Macedonia, yet Alexander's campaign did not end with a single battle. He pursued the remnants of the rebellion, securing the region with a series of swift and calculated strikes. In every village and stronghold, the message was clear: Macedonia would not be divided, and its young leader would not be defied. To mark this triumph, and perhaps to send a message to friend and foe alike, Alexander founded a new city upon the conquered land. He named it Alexandropolis, a city that would bear his name, standing as a symbol of both his leadership and his vision for the future. By the time news of the campaign reached Pella, the whispers had changed. The boy regent had proven himself in battle and in strategy. The crown might not yet rest upon his brow, but his grip upon Macedonia had grown stronger than ever. And as the prince returned to the palace, the advisors who once doubted him now watched with wary respect. A leader had risen, and his gaze was already reaching beyond the borders of the known. Tensions at the table. Yet within the walls of the palace, new storms were gathering. Storms not of war, but of the heart and the home. King Philip returned from his campaign in high spirits, bearing both victory and a new wife, Cleopatra Eurydice. Her arrival at court sent ripples through the fragile balance of royal life. For Olympias, Alexander's mother, this new union was a wound to both pride and power. And for Alexander, it stirred deeper fears that a new heir might one day challenge his right to rule. The tension simmered beneath the surface of court life, unseen but palpable. At banquets and ceremonies, polite smiles masked the growing unease. Yet words once spoken cannot be so easily hidden. During a great feast celebrating Philip's marriage, the tension finally broke into open flame. Surrounded by nobles and warriors, one of Philip's men rose to toast the king and his new queen. But in his drunken pride, he let his words stray too far. He spoke of the hope that Philip would now father a true Macedonian heir, a clear slight against Alexander, whose bloodline was part Epirot through Olympias. Silence fell upon the hall. All eyes turned to Alexander. The young prince rose, his face cold with anger. Words sharp as steel passed between him and the offender. Then, with a final glare, Alexander stormed from the banquet, leaving behind a court stunned into silence. The fracture between father and son had deepened. Though Alexander remained loyal to Philip's rule, a shadow now lay across their bond. In the days that followed, Olympias withdrew to her own quarters, her bitterness growing. Alexander, too, kept to himself, his mind restless with thought. The dreams of empire still burned within him, but now uncertainty clouded the path ahead. In the halls of Pella, beneath the gleam of stone and gold, the seeds of future conflict were being sown, and in the heart of the young prince, the fire of ambition flared brighter still. A king fall's seasons turned, and with them came new beginnings and unseen endings. A great wedding was to be held, uniting Philip's daughter in marriage to a noble ally. The court gathered in celebration, the air thick with music and wine. Yet beneath the joy, tension still lingered, old wounds unhealed, rivalries unresolved. On the day of the ceremony, crowds filled the grand theatre. Philip entered in triumph, clad in regal splendor, his stride proud and unguarded. At his side, his guards stood watch, but fate often finds a way through armor and vigilance alike. As the procession moved forward, a lone assassin broke from the crowd. With swift and terrible purpose, he struck. In the stunned silence that followed, the great king of Macedonia fell upon the stone. His lifeblood stained the ground. His breath fled beneath the sky that had once echoed with his conquests. Chaos erupted. Guards seized the assassin, but it was too late. The king was dead. News of the tragedy spread like wildfire. Grief swept through the court, mingled with fear and uncertainty. Macedonia now stood upon the edge of a blade. In the palace, a young man stood alone. Alexander. He was just 20 years old. The throne lay before him, not as a gift, but as a perilous burden. Enemies within the court eyed the moment as their chance to seize power. Outside Macedonia, rival kings watched with interest, sensing weakness. Yet Alexander did not waver. The lessons of Aristotle, the campaigns of youth, the fire forged in the shadow of his father, all had prepared him for this hour. He called upon the army first. Their loyalty would be the foundation of his rule. With commanding presence, he addressed the soldiers who had once followed Philip. In the eyes of these hardened men, he saw both doubt and hope. His words were few, but they rang with iron resolve. Macedonia would not fall. The dream of empire would not die. One by one, the soldiers pledged their loyalty, not to a boy, but to a leader. Within days, Alexander secured the support of key nobles and allies. The storm of uncertainty began to settle. At 20, the crown was his. Not by chance, but by the force of will and vision. And as he gazed out upon the land he was now sworn to protect and expand, the young king understood that the true test had only begun. The throne was his. But to keep it, and to fulfill the dream his father had begun, he would need to reach farther than any king before him. A new chapter was about to unfold, one that would carry Alexander far beyond the hills of Macedonia, into legend. Chapter 5. A King at 20. The torchlight flickered low across the stone walls of the palace, shadows moving like ghosts from the past. In one hall, mourners still whispered over Philip's body. In another, decisions were already being made, and at the center of it all stood a 20-year-old man, his eyes steady, his voice calm, his path already set. Alexander did not wait. While the kingdom mourned, he moved. The world would not pause for grief. Enemies would not wait for ceremonies. The crown could not rest in silence. Within hours of Philip's death, Alexander secured the army's loyalty. First by honoring the generals who had long served his father, and then by reminding them what came next. Loyalty was not asked for. It was affirmed. From there, he turned to the nobility. Some families had hoped the chaos might bring them power. Some dreamed of the crown shifting to another branch. But Alexander, with a voice forged in battle and learning, stood before them as their rightful king. His message was clear. Macedonia needed unity, not division, and he would bring it, by persuasion or by force. His actions were swift and deliberate. Those who wavered were brought into line. Those who conspired were cut away. The court soon learned that while the prince they had once known was young, the king who now stood before them was unyielding. Outside the palace, The air trembled with uncertainty. News of Philip's death spread quickly through Macedonia and beyond. In the far corners of the kingdom, restless factions stirred. Some cities began to whisper of freedom. Some tribes thought the time had come to reclaim old lands, but they had misjudged their new king. Alexander's first act was to send a clear signal. There would be no weakness in Macedonia, no pause between kings. The transition of power would not be a soft one. It would be a sword drawn cleanly from its sheath. And as the sun rose over Pella, Alexander stood upon the palace steps, no longer a prince in his father's shadow, but a king whose gaze already reached beyond his own land. The sword over Thebes. For all the strength Alexander now commanded in Macedonia, the cities of Greece watched with wary eyes. Chief among them was Thebes, a proud city with a long memory and little love for Macedonian rule. When news of Philip's death reached Thebes, hope bloomed among its leaders. They believed the young king would struggle to hold his throne. They believed the time for rebellion had come. They were wrong. Reports of unrest in Thebes reached Alexander quickly. The city had driven out the Macedonian garrison. The banners of defiance once again flew above its walls. Word spread through Greece. Was Macedonia's grip weakening? Alexander did not answer with words. He answered with march and steel. With remarkable speed, he gathered his forces and moved south. The young king rode at their head, determination carved into every line of his face. The message was simple. There would be no rebellion, no delay, no forgiveness. As his army approached, many cities watched in dread. Some sent envoys to swear loyalty once more. But Thebes stood firm behind its walls, trusting in allies and its own strength. The siege began beneath a sky heavy with summer heat. Macedonian forces encircled the city, cutting it off from aid. The walls of Thebes, tall and proud, had withstood many foes, but Alexander's will was unyielding. Then, in a carefully timed assault, Macedonian forces broke through. The streets of Thebes became rivers of fire and blood. Resistance crumbled. Alexander ordered the city destroyed. Stone by stone, Thebes was razed. Its houses burned, its temples toppled. Of those who survived, many were sold into slavery. Only the sacred grounds of poets and gods were spared, a gesture to the legacy of Greek culture, even amid ruin. The message rang clear across all of Greece. Defiance would not be tolerated. One city erased, all others warned. From the smouldering ruins of Thebes, Alexander turned north once more. He carried no joy in the destruction, but no regret either. A king must act not for approval, but for the security of his realm, and the realm was now watching, as was the world beyond. The ghosts of Greece. The fall of Thebes sent shockwaves through the land. Cities that had once whispered of freedom now fell into silence. Athens, the great heart of Greek learning, hesitated, on the edge of rebellion, but did not act. Its leaders sent envoys to Alexander, their words wrapped in caution and respect. Sparta, fierce and proud, remained apart as always. But even the Spartans chose words over war, for they had seen what had become of Thebes. In halls where philosophers debated, in markets where traders gossiped, in temples where prayers rose, one truth now echoed. There was a new king in Macedonia, and he was ready. Some bowed out of fear, others out of awe. But all now recognized that the young king who had taken the throne with such certainty would not be easily challenged. Alexander, for his part, understood the delicate balance. He accepted the envoys of Athens with measured grace, He sent messages to other cities, reaffirming their place within the League of Corinth, the alliance Philip had forged to unite Greece against Persia. Yet beneath these formalities, he moved with quiet purpose. Each agreement, each meeting, was another stone laid in the foundation of a greater vision. He had brought Greece to heel, not through diplomacy alone, but through the raw clarity of his actions. The sword over Thebes was now a shadow cast across all of Greece. But Alexander did not seek to rule Greece alone. His eyes had already lifted to a greater prize, one that shimmered beyond the Aegean Sea, the empire of empires. Persia, the time, was coming to turn vision into action. And the young king, tempered by battle and loss, was ready to take the first step. From king to commander. With Greece secured, Alexander stood at the threshold of a new chapter. He was no longer merely king of Macedonia. He was now the commander of a united Greek force, the leader of an alliance poised to march beyond the known. Yet preparation was needed. The Persian Empire was vast and rich, its armies numerous. Its kings ruled from grand palaces in the east, their reach extending across deserts and mountains. To challenge such power would require more than courage. It would demand precision, resilience, and the ability to inspire. Alexander began by securing his own kingdom fully. He appointed trusted governors to oversee the regions of Macedonia. He ensured the loyalty of the army with both reward and promise. Then he turned to his war council. Plans were drawn, supply lines organized, ships readied for the Great Crossing. Scouts gathered intelligence on Persian forces and the terrain ahead. But beyond these practical matters, Alexander prepared himself in deeper ways. He studied the histories of Persia, learning its strengths and its fractures. He walked the halls of Pella, contemplating the legacy he would leave behind. At night, beneath starlit skies, he often stood alone. The same stars that had watched over his father now lit his path. And in their cold, steady light, he shaped a resolve that would not waver. For in the silence between each breath, one thought burned clear. Macedonia was secure. Greece was united. Now, the road to empire awaited, and Alexander, still only 20, would ride at its head, not merely as a king, but as a commander whose destiny had only begun to unfold. Soon, the ships would set sail. Soon, the clash of civilizations would begin, and the world would learn what it meant to follow the star of Alexander. Chapter 6. Into Asia, into legend. The sea shimmered beneath a pale sky, its waves soft against the hulls of a great fleet. Above them, the winds of spring carried a promise of new beginnings. On the deck of the lead ship stood a young king, Alexander, 22, eyes fixed upon the distant shore of Asia. The time had come. Behind him sailed an army of Macedonians and Greeks, bound not for simple conquest, but for a place in history. Ahead lay the Persian Empire, vast, ancient, and proud. Its kings ruled from golden halls, its armies stretched beyond the horizon. Yet Alexander's gaze was not clouded by fear. As the coast of Asia Minor drew near, the king prepared a symbol for the ages. In his hand, he held a long spear, not for battle, but for a gesture that would echo beyond the moment. When the ship reached land, Alexander did not wait for ceremony. He leapt from the deck and strode ashore. There, beneath the rising sun and before his gathered men, he thrust his spear deep into the earth. This was no simple act. It was a claim, not by treaty, not by marriage, but by right of conquest. The land beneath his feet was now his, taken not through words, but through will. The soldiers cheered, their voices rising with the surf. The crossing of the Hellespont, once a barrier between worlds, was now a gateway. Alexander had stepped from Europe into Asia, and with that step, the course of history shifted. But the king did not linger in celebration. There was more to this crossing than the start of a campaign. There were shadows of the past to honor and a destiny to embrace. With the spear in the soil and the winds behind him, Alexander turned toward the ancient city of Troy. Troy revisited. The road to Troy wound through hills brushed by soft winds. Wildflowers marked the path, their colors bright beneath the endless sky. Alexander rode at the head of his retinue, his thoughts turning inward with each passing mile. Troy, the city of legend, the stage of heroes. It was here that Achilles, the greatest warrior of myth, had fought and fallen. For Alexander, raised on tales of the Iliad, this was more than a visit. It was a pilgrimage. At last they reached the ruins, stones weathered by centuries, yet still echoing with the weight of story. The king dismounted and walked alone among the fallen walls and empty towers. The silence was deep, as if the earth itself remembered the clash of bronze and the cries of men long gone. At the tomb of Achilles, Alexander paused. Before him lay a simple mound, unadorned yet powerful. He knelt, placing a wreath upon the grave. Here, hero and heir met across the centuries. A boy once inspired by Homer's words now stood where legend had walked. In that quiet moment, the king reflected. Achilles had sought glory above all, his name to outlast stone and time. But glory came with cost. Pride, loss, and the bitterness of fleeting life shadowed the hero's tale. Alexander rose, the wind stirring his cloak. He carried the lessons of Achilles in his heart, both the triumph and the tragedy. His own path would not be a simple echo, it would be a story written anew. As he left the tomb, the army prepared to march again. The visit to Troy had not been for spectacle, it had been a communion with fate. A reminder that legends were made by those who dared to step beyond the known. And Alexander, with the voice of Homer whispering in his mind, was ready to do just that. The River of Blood. The road from Troy led eastward through rolling plains and wide valleys. In their path stood the river Granicus, its waters cold and swift, its banks guarded by Persian forces ready to test the young king's resolve. Word had spread quickly. The Persian satraps had gathered a force of cavalry and mercenaries, determined to halt the invader before his legend could grow. They believed that Alexander, bold but young, would hesitate before such a crossing. Again, they were wrong. Reaching the river, Alexander surveyed the scene. The banks were steep, the current strong. The Persian cavalry waited on the far side, shields gleaming in the sun. Many of his commanders urged caution, to wait, to find a safer point to cross. But the king knew that hesitation breeds doubt. Speed and surprise were his allies. With a calm voice, he gave the order. The attack began with Alexander at its heart. Clad in shining armor, he led the charge across the river, water churning around the legs of the horses. Arrows flew from the far bank. Spears awaited them. Yet forward they rode, driven by the will of their king. As the Macedonians reached the far side, the battle erupted in fierce close combat. Blades clashed, dust and cries filled the air. Alexander fought at the front, his presence a beacon to his men. Then, amid the chaos, danger struck. A Persian noble charged, sword raised high. In a flash, the blade came down, aimed at the king's unguarded head. The blow struck with force, breaking Alexander's helmet and drawing blood. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath, but death did not come. With swift reflex, Alexander struck back, cutting down his attacker. His comrades surged to protect him, driving the Persians back. Wounded but unbroken, the young king fought on, his spirit igniting the ranks. The tide turned. One by one, the Persian defenders faltered, then fled. The river, once a barrier, now ran red with the cost of defiance. Victory belonged to Alexander, yet the wound beneath his shattered helmet was a reminder. Fate had spared him this day, but the road ahead would offer no safety. Still, the first great test had been met, and the world had begun to watch. A name, written in water as the dust. Of battle settled, the fields beside the Granicus stood silent. The wounded were tended, the dead mourned. Among them, Alexander moved with purpose. He saw not only the cost of victory, but its meaning. This was more than a battle won. It was a message sent. The Persian Empire, long thought invincible, had been challenged and had yielded. Across the rivers and plains of Asia Minor, news of the battle spread swiftly. Cities once held by Persian governors began to falter. Some opened their gates willingly, others prepared to resist, their hearts troubled by the stories of a young king who led from the front and who had crossed the river of blood unshaken. In camps and courts alike, a single name now stirred both fear and fascination: Alexander. He did not linger long by the Granicus. The march resumed, each step carrying his army deeper into the heart of the empire. Yet in quiet moments, the king reflected. He had survived where death had reached for him. He had seized ground where legends once tread, and he had begun to write his own story, not upon stone or scroll, but upon the living land, upon rivers and roads that would carry his name farther still. The spear in the soil, the wreath at Troy, the blood in the river, each had marked a beginning. The world had started to remember his name, and as Alexander gazed toward the rising sun, he knew the greatest chapters were yet to come. Chapter 7: The Liberator of Ionia. The winds of early summer carried the scent of salt and distant lands. Across the waters of the Aegean Sea, word had already spread. Alexander had crossed into Asia, and the river Granicus now ran red with victory. The name of the young Macedonian king whispered through the cities of Ionia, through marbled streets, bustling markets, and shaded courtyards. For generations, these cities, Ephesus, Miletus, and others, had stood under Persian rule. Though Greek in blood and spirit, they had long bowed to the Eastern kings. Now, as Alexander's army swept south along the coast, choice approached with every sunrise: resist and risk ruin, or open their gates and embrace a new future. In Ephesus, the choice was made swiftly. The memory of Macedonian power was still fresh, and the wounds of Persian rule ran deep. When Alexander's scouts reached its walls, they found no resistance. The gates opened wide, and the people poured forth in welcome. Flowers adorned the soldiers' path. Statues of Persian governors were torn down, their shattered remains scattered in the dust. Alexander entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. In the great temple of Artemis, he offered tribute, honoring the shared heritage of gods and men. His message to the people was clear. The yoke of Persia was broken, but order would remain. Temples would be protected, laws respected. Only loyalty to the new alliance was required. Other cities watched and weighed their own decisions. Miletus, though proud, soon followed the same path. Its leaders, seeing the might of Alexander's forces and the eager welcome at Ephesus, chose peace over resistance. They too opened their gates, their people hopeful that the Macedonian king would honor his words. Each new city added strength to Alexander's cause, not only in arms, but in spirit. He moved not as a mere invader, but as one who sought to reshape the land. The banners of Persia were falling, and in their place, a new vision was taking root. Yet not all would submit so easily. There were cities, proud and defiant, where the past clung tight. And for them, Alexander carried not only olive branches, but the steel of war. Walls that resist. Southward the army moved, along roads worn by centuries of trade and conquest. Beneath the shadow of each new hill, another city awaited. A choice, still unmade. Some, like Halicarnassus, chose defiance. High upon its walls, the city's defenders stood ready. Behind them, Persian commanders and Greek mercenaries swore they would hold the gates against the young king's fury. Alexander did not hesitate. He ordered his engineers forward, masters of siegecraft drawn from across the Greek world. Towers rose beneath the summer sky, built with haste and precision. Great rams were assembled, their iron heads eager to test the strength of ancient stone. The siege began. Day and night, the Macedonian forces pressed the attack. Arrows flew in dark clouds, stones crashed against the gates, fires roared along the battlements, yet the defenders held. Halicarnassus would not fall easily. Weeks stretched into months, supplies dwindled. Heat and fatigue wore at the soldiers' resolve. But Alexander's will was unbroken. He visited the siege works daily, speaking with his men, standing beneath the same arrows that sought their lives. His presence, calm and unwavering, became a pillar around which the army gathered its strength. Then, under the cover of night, a breach was made. Macedonian forces surged through the gap. The fighting was brutal, the streets running with the cost of stubborn pride. At dawn, the city was Alexander's. Its defenders scattered or captured, its Persian masters fled. Yet even in victory, the king chose discipline over chaos. The looting was controlled. The citizens spared unnecessary cruelty. The message was sent. Resistance would be crushed, but justice would follow. From the blackened ruins of defiance, Alexander's banner rose anew. The cities of Ionia watched closely. The olive branch was still offered, but now its shadow bore the weight of a sword, the olive branch and the pike. With each new dawn, Alexander's march continued. The coast of Asia Minor bent beneath his advance, its cities faced with the same choice, peace or ruin. The young king mastered a delicate balance, mercy tempered with the threat of overwhelming force. Where gates were opened in welcome, Alexander honored his word. Local rulers were allowed to remain, temples were protected, and the autonomy of Greek traditions respected. In these cities, the olive branch took root. The people saw in Alexander not a foreign tyrant, but a restorer of Greek pride, a liberator who carried the dreams of a unified world. Yet the pike was never far from reach. In towns where Persian loyalists still stirred rebellion, swift action followed. Garrison forces were left behind to maintain order. Spies and informants were employed to root out plots. When dissent arose, it was met with decisive force. Alexander's approach was both strategic and psychological. He understood that conquest alone would not win the war. Hearts and minds must be shaped as surely as battlefields. At each conquered city, proclamations were made. freedom from Persian tribute, restoration of local governance, and alliance with the new Macedonian-led order. Yet these words carried an unspoken truth. Those who doubted would face the same fate as Halicarnassus. Through this careful mix of kindness and terror, Alexander transformed the coast. The cities of Ionia began to see not merely a king on campaign, but a force reshaping their future. From Ephesus to Miletus, from ruined walls to open squares, a new order spread like dawnlight over the land. And in its glow, Alexander's name grew ever stronger, spoken in markets and temples, from soldiers to scholars alike. But the coast was only the beginning. Ahead lay the heart of empire, the lands where Persian kings still ruled from ancient thrones. And Alexander, his path clear, prepared to march east, to the center of empire. With the coastal cities secured, Alexander paused to consolidate his gains. Garrison forces were strengthened, supply lines ensured, messages were sent across the Aegean, news of victory, of liberation, of a king whose reach now spanned the western edge of Asia. Yet the young king's gaze did not linger on past triumphs. The true war had yet to begin. Beyond the mountains and plains lay the core of the Persian Empire, a realm of immense wealth, vast armies and proud kings. Darius III now stood as Alexander's great rival, a monarch determined to crush the upstart invader. But Alexander had no intention of retreating. He knew that to stop was to invite doubt, to lose momentum. The next phase of the campaign would carry them deeper into enemy lands, toward battles that would test every skill, every strength. As summer ripened into fall, the army prepared. Veterans trained the newer recruits. Engineers refined siege tools. Scouts rode ahead, gathering precious knowledge of the road east. And in the quiet moments between preparation and march, Alexander stood beneath the stars, those same stars that had once guided Achilles across distant shores. Now they marked a new journey. For the king of Macedonia, the road to Darius was not simply a path of conquest. It was a calling, a chance to fulfill the vision planted beneath the groves of Mieza, whispered through the tombs of Troy. He would not merely take land, he would reshape an empire. And as the army struck camp and turned its banners eastward, one truth rang clear across the land. The storm had only begun. Alexander, the liberator of Ionia, now marched to the center of empire. Chapter 8. The Gordian Knot. The road wound through the heart of Phrygia, its dust rising in soft clouds beneath the feet of Alexander's advancing army. Spring had come to Asia Minor. The fields stretched green and gold beneath skies of deep blue. Each passing day carried the young king deeper into lands once ruled by Persian kings, and closer to the seat of their empire. But as the march continued, word reached Alexander of a place where legend lingered, a city where prophecy hung, in the air like morning mist. Gordium. The name stirred whispers among soldiers and scholars alike. It was a city of ancient kings and older tales, and within its walls, secured beneath the gaze of priests and nobles, lay an object few dared to challenge: the Gordian Knot. The story was well known. Long ago, a humble farmer named Gordius had ridden into the city upon a simple chariot. Guided by prophecy, the people made him their king. In honor of this fate, the yoke of his chariot had been bound with an intricate knot, one so tangled that no eye could trace its beginning or end. Over time, the knot became more than a symbol of kingship. It became a puzzle wrapped in legend. The oracle declared that whoever could loosen it would rule not just Phrygia, but all of Asia. Now, as Alexander approached, the tale was retold in every hall and camp. Priests prepared the sacred space. Historians sharpened their quills, eager to record what might unfold. The air in Gordium grew thick with expectation, for here stood a challenge no army could breach, no siege could conquer, a test of mind, of will, and perhaps of destiny itself. Alexander, ever drawn to such tests, smiled when he heard the tale. In his heart, he felt the pull of fate. He would see this knot, he would face it, and what followed would be written across the world. The Cut of Clarity, the Palace of Gordium, stood at the city's heart, an aging structure of stone and wood, draped in banners that fluttered softly in the breeze. Within its courtyard, beneath an open sky, the ancient chariot rested. Time had worn its frame, but the knot remained untouched. Its cords thick and gnarled, a serpent coiled upon itself. Alexander entered with a small retinue. Priests in white robes watched from the shadows, their faces solemn. Around them stood scribes and curious onlookers. The weight of centuries hung over the moment. The young king approached the chariot in silence. His eyes traced the knot, following its loops and turns. The cords were wound so tightly that no gap could be seen, no end could be found. Many had tried before him. Rulers, warriors, scholars, all had failed. For a time, Alexander studied it with quiet intensity. His mind, honed by years beneath Aristotle's guidance, saw the knot not merely as rope, but as a symbol, a challenge set before him by both history and fate. Then, without a word, he drew his sword. The gathered priests gasped. Scribes leaned forward, their quills poised. Soldiers held their breath. With a single swift stroke, Alexander brought the blade down. The knot parted beneath the steel, its cords falling in two upon the earth. Silence followed, a moment suspended in time. Then whispers rose, spreading through the crowd like ripples across water. He had not solved the knot, he had ended it. Alexander sheathed his sword and turned away, his expression calm. The prophecy had not spoken of how the knot must be undone, only that it must be loosened. In his eyes, the path was clear. Fate was not a puzzle to be studied endlessly. It was a force, to be shaped. As word of the act spread beyond Gordium, reactions were swift and divided. Yet one truth now stood beyond question. Alexander had faced the knot, and it had not bound him. The echo of the act. In the days that followed, the story of the Gordian knot swept across the land, told in markets and temples, repeated in courts and camps. It grew with each retelling. Some called it cheating, a crude solution to a sacred puzzle. They argued that the true test was one of patience and wisdom, not the edge of a blade. Others called it genius. In a world ruled by hesitation and tradition, Alexander had shown a clarity of purpose few possessed. He had refused to be trapped by the expectations of others. To his own men, it was a sign of destiny fulfilled. The prophecy had not demanded subtlety, only success. In ending the knot's hold, Alexander had claimed the mantle of the conqueror, foretold. The king himself spoke little of the matter. When asked, he merely said that the path to greatness was not bound by rope or custom. It was forged through will. And so the act echoed far beyond the walls of Gordium. It became a symbol of Alexander's rule, a message carried by sword and word alike. Nothing would bind him. No tradition too sacred, no enemy too vast, no problem too complex. Where others hesitated, he would act. Where others saw barriers, he would see the path forward. In this simple yet profound act, Alexander had revealed a truth that would define his entire campaign. He was not here to inherit the old world. He was here to change it. The knot within. As the army resumed its march, the lessons of Gordium lingered, not just in the minds of those who had watched, but within Alexander himself. For beneath the bold stroke of his sword lay a deeper understanding. The knot was not only rope, it was the doubts that snared the mind, the fears that slowed the heart. It was the weight of expectation, the tangle of fate. Alexander carried many such knots within him. The memory of his father's death, the uncertainty of ruling so young, the weight of leading an army into lands unknown. Each step eastward would tighten those cords, each challenge seeking to bind him. But Gordium had taught him anew. The way forward was through decisive clarity. When fear arose, he would face it. When obstacles stood in his path, he would cut through them, not recklessly, but with purpose. The same resolve that had parted the ancient knot would guide him through trials yet unseen. And as the road to the heart of Persia stretched before him, Alexander rode with a mind unbound. The lesson of Gordium was clear. No rope, no doubt, no fate would hold him. He would march not as one trapped by the past, but as one shaping the future with every stride. And so the army moved on, eastward beneath endless skies, toward battles that would shake the world and toward a legacy still waiting to be written. Chapter 9. When Persia knocked. The air was thick with mist as dawn broke over the narrow coastline of southern Anatolia. There, where the mountains met the sea, a shallow river called the Pinarus wound its way between steep ridges. The land seemed to funnel inward, as if nature itself conspired to draw two great forces together. On one side, the vast army of Persia gathered. On the other, a leaner force led by a young king whose ambitions burned brighter than the morning sun. For months, King Darius III of Persia had prepared. Word had traveled swift and fearful across the empire. Alexander of Macedon was coming. With each step, the young invader left cities fallen, armies scattered, and doubts growing in the hearts of those who had once believed Persia to be eternal. Now, Darius himself had taken the field to end this threat. His forces outnumbered the Macedonians many times over. Soldiers from every corner of his empire, from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Bactria, stood ready beneath his banner. Their armor shimmered like fish scales beneath the grey sky. Their chariots gleamed. Their bows were strung. Their elephants rumbled restlessly in the rear. And yet, the very land they stood upon would betray them. The narrow plain of Issus, hemmed in by the mountains and the sea, denied Darius the space his vast army needed to maneuver. The mass of soldiers pressed together, ranks tight and restless. There was little room for the sweeping cavalry charges or the flanking maneuvers that had brought victory in battles past. Here, the strength of numbers became a tangle of men and horses trapped between stone and water. Across the river, Alexander surveyed the field. His gaze was sharp, steady. He had ridden hard to reach this place, driving his weary army through storm and mud to face the Persian king head-on. Now, as he looked upon the crowded ranks of his enemy, he saw opportunity. The land would favor the bold, and there were none more bold than Alexander. He gathered his commanders. With calm words and clear orders, he laid out the plan. The phalanx would anchor the center, a wall of spears and shields moving as one. On the right, Alexander himself would lead the companion cavalry, the elite riders who followed him as they would a god. Their charge would strike where the enemy was weakest, where confusion already festered. Speed and courage would be their greatest weapons. As the sun climbed higher, the two kings prepared. One, Darius, hoped to crush the invader with sheer might. The other, Alexander, sought not merely victory, but glory. One river, one battlefield, one day would decide whose vision would shape the future. The arrow and the chariot. The trumpet sounded. A single note echoed across the plain, sharp as a blade. Then came the roar. Thousands of voices rising as one, the earth trembling beneath iron-shod hooves and marching feet. The Battle of Issus had begun. Alexander led the charge. Clad in shining armor, with the plumes of his helmet streaming like a comet's tail, he rode at the head of the companion cavalry, his spear pointed forward, eyes fixed upon the heart of the Persian line. Around him, the companions surged, the best horsemen of Macedonia, their loyalty unshaken, their courage beyond doubt. They crossed the Pinarus under a hail of arrows. The river was no more than a shallow obstacle. Its waters churned to foam beneath the pounding hooves. Arrows glanced from shields and armor. The companions rode on. Ahead, the Persian line braced. Darius had placed his finest troops at the center, the famed Persian immortals, warriors of unmatched skill and discipline. Yet even they had little space to maneuver. The ground beneath them became a trap of bodies and fear. With a cry, Alexander plunged into their midst. The clash was thunderous. Spears shattered, swords flashed. Horse and man pressed into the press of enemies. Yet the Macedonian charge did not break. Like a wedge of iron, they split the Persian center. And there, through the smoke and chaos, Alexander saw him, Darius, the great king. High upon his royal chariot, the Persian ruler watched as his army faltered. The eyes of his soldiers turned toward him, seeking strength, seeking resolve. But the young Macedonian's charge was relentless. The tide of battle turned toward the royal chariot. Panic flickered in Darius's gaze. His bodyguards fell one by one. The immortals wavered. With the companions but a spear's length away, the great king did what kings rarely admit to doing. He fled. Whipping the reins, Darius turned his chariot and sped from the field. Behind him, his army saw and followed. The myth of Persian invincibility, so carefully crafted over generations, crumbled in an instant. In the dust of Issus, Alexander had not only won a battle, he had shattered an empire's illusion of strength. The captives and the king. As the sun dipped low, the field of Issus lay strewn with the remnants of war. Broken chariots, fallen standards, wounded and weary soldiers littered the ground. Yet amidst the ruins, a quieter scene unfolded, one that would reveal the heart of the conqueror. Among those left behind in Darius's hasty flight was the Persian royal family. His mother, his wife, and his daughters had been abandoned in the royal tent, left to the mercy of the victors. They awaited their fate with trembling hearts, certain that dishonor or death would soon follow. But Alexander had no such cruelty in mind. Word reached him of the royal captives. At once, he ordered they be brought before him, not as prisoners, but as honored guests. Dressed in his finest cloak, he entered their tent not with sword drawn, but with words of comfort. The mother of Darius, bowing low, begged for mercy. She spoke through tears, believing her son slain. Gently, Alexander raised her head. "Your son lives," he assured her. "He has fled, and I pursue him not out of hatred, but out of duty. He then addressed them all. You shall be treated not as captives, but as royalty. Your dignity shall remain untouched. What was yours before shall remain yours still. And so it was. The Persian queen and her daughters received every courtesy. No soldier was permitted to approach them without leave. Their chambers were guarded, not against escape, but to ensure their peace. In this, Alexander showed the world that he sought not vengeance, but honor. His greatness would not be measured by cruelty, but by the respect he granted even to those whom fate had placed in his power. Word of this mercy spread swiftly, through Persia, through Greece, through every land that watched the young kings march, and with it grew a legend that Alexander was not merely a conqueror of lands, but a master of hearts. The road widens. The victory at Issus opened more than a river pass. It opened the path to Asia. The Persian army had fled, its morale broken. The great king had retreated eastward, seeking refuge and allies. And before Alexander lay a land rich in cities, treasures, and history. Yet as his army rested and tended its wounds, Alexander looked beyond the spoils of war. To him, conquest was not an end, but a means. He sought more than land. He sought legacy. Letters arrived. Envoys came with offers of gold and peace from Darius, seeking to ransom his family and to buy back the lands already lost. But Alexander refused. All Asia is mine by right of arms, he declared. I will take what I have won not through bargaining, but through destiny. With careful preparation, he set his sights southward. The great coastal cities, Tyre, Sidon, Gaza, would be his next objectives. These strongholds of Phoenician trade and Persian loyalty stood as keys to controlling the eastern Mediterranean. At each step, Alexander's gaze remained fixed beyond the next battle. He spoke to his men not of gold, but of greatness. We do not fight for plunder, he reminded them. We fight to shape a new world. And the army followed. Veterans who had marched from Greece, new allies from the lands they passed, all drawn by the vision of a young king who seemed destined for more than kingship. The road widened with every victory, but with each step came new challenges, harder cities, fiercer foes, and the vast unknown beyond Persia's eastern borders. Yet Alexander pressed on, for in his heart he knew the story of Issus was but the beginning. The world awaited, and he would not stop until it was his. Chapter 10. The Island That Would Not Bow. It was a jewel upon the sea, ancient, proud, and unyielding. The island city of Tyre stood just off the coast of Phoenicia, its tall stone walls rising straight from the waters of the Mediterranean. The sea itself was its first defense. No simple road led to its gates. Only ships could reach its harbors, guarded by high towers and iron gates. For centuries, Tyre had ruled these waters, its fleets carrying the purple dye and rich goods that had made it famous throughout the world. Now, the island faced a storm unlike any before. Alexander of Macedon, fresh from victory at Issus, had marched south to claim the great coastal cities of the east. One by one, they had opened their gates or fallen before him. But when his messengers reached Tyre, the answer was defiance. Tyre would not bow. It was not merely a city, it was a fortress of the sea, long used to standing apart from the powers of the land. Its citizens believed no army could touch them here, and so they sent Alexander's envoys away, their words sharp with mockery. From the high walls, Tyrian archers taunted the Macedonians gathered on the distant shore. Most conquerors would have moved on. The fleetless Macedonian army could not cross the water, and time was precious. But Alexander did not turn away. His eyes, fixed upon the island, burned with determination. To leave Tyre unconquered would leave a scar upon his path of glory. The island had refused him, and now he would not refuse its challenge. He rowed along the coast, studying the waters. He watched the tides, the currents, the shape of the seabed beneath the waves. He listened as his engineers spoke of the difficulties, but no words of caution swayed him. "We will build a path to Tyre," he declared. "Stone by stone, we will bring the land to the sea." And so began one of the most remarkable feats of ancient siegecraft, an act of sheer will that would test the patience of an army and the pride of a city. Stone by stone. At first, the task seemed simple enough. From the mainland, a narrow strip of land, a natural causeway, reached partway toward the island. It would serve as a foundation. Upon this, Alexander ordered a great mole to be built, a solid road of earth and stone stretching across the sea to Tyre's walls. The work was slow, heavy, and dangerous. Trees were felled in the forests inland and dragged to the shore. Rocks, some as large as men, were quarried from nearby hills. Sand and smaller stones were carried in endless streams of wagons. Soldiers, engineers, and laborers toiled side by side, moving each piece into place. Day by day, the causeway inched forward. In the shallows, the work went quickly enough. But as the mole reached deeper water, the sea pushed back. Waves battered the stones. The seabed shifted beneath the weight. The deeper the causeway grew, the harder each step became. From their walls, the Tyrians watched with growing alarm. At first, they had laughed, certain that no land-bound army could truly threaten them. But as the days passed and the mole crept ever closer, their mockery turned to concern. They sent swift ships to harass the workers. Archers fired down from the towers. Divers swam beneath the surface, pulling stones from the foundations. Yet the Macedonians pressed on. Alexander himself rode along the growing road, urging his men forward. "This is not a battle of swords," he told them. "It is a battle of endurance." Weeks turned to months. Under the sun and the stars, the soldiers labored. The causeway stretched further, now within bowshot of the island. The Tyrians prepared for the siege to come, but they had not yet played their strongest hand. Fire in the waves, one quiet dawn, as the causeway neared the island's edge, the Tyrians struck. Under cover of darkness, they prepared a terrible weapon. A ship packed with dry wood, pitch, and oil, its mast hung with burning torches. A fire ship. As the first light touched the sea, the Tyrian fleet surged forward. Warships flanked the fire ship, guarding its deadly cargo. The Macedonian sentries cried out in alarm. On the narrow causeway, there was little room to flee or fight. The fire ship, guided by daring sailors, slammed into the wooden towers and siege engines that Alexander had built at the mole's end. Flames leapt skyward, the air filled with smoke and screams. In moments, months of work were consumed by fire. The towers collapsed into the sea. The causeway itself cracked beneath the heat. It was a bitter blow. For a moment, the army wavered. Some urged Alexander to abandon the siege. Tyre had shown that the sea was still its ally, but the young king refused defeat. He gathered his men, soothed their anger, and laid out a new plan. The causeway would be rebuilt, stronger this time, wider, and with stone rather than wood at its edge. Towering siege engines would rise again, and he would not stop. More ships were brought down from northern ports. Alexander began to assemble a makeshift fleet. With it, he could finally challenge the Tyrians at sea. No longer would the island command the waves alone. The work resumed, Day after day, stone by stone, the causeway grew anew. The Macedonians sang as they labored, their voices rising over the sound of hammer and tide. Their king was with them, always, watching, working, reminding them of the prize that waited beyond the waves. Tyre had bloodied the invaders, but it had not broken their will. The sea, once a shield, was becoming a bridge, and the island's time was running short. Day the island bled 7 long months had passed. Summer deepened over the land and sea. The causeway, now a massive stone road, touched the very walls of Tyre. Alexander's siege engines stood ready, towering rams and catapults that hurled stone and fire against the defences. At sea, the balance had shifted. Alexander's fleet, cobbled together from allied ships, now matched the Tyrian navy. The island was surrounded, its lifelines severed. Still, the defenders fought with the courage of those who knew there would be no surrender. The final assault came beneath a blazing sun. Great siege towers rolled down the causeway, their fronts shielded against arrows and flame. Battering rams pounded at the walls. Catapults launched stone after stone. The very sea seemed to tremble with the force of the attack. At last, a section of the wall cracked. Stones tumbled into the waves. A breach had been made. The Macedonian trumpets sounded. With shields raised and swords drawn, the assault troops surged forward. They stormed through the breach, climbing over rubble, fighting hand to hand against the desperate defenders. From the ships, more troops landed, scaling ladders onto the sea-facing walls. Arrows flew thick as rain. The clash of steel echoed across the waters. Hour by hour, the defenders were pushed back. The streets of Tyre, once filled with proud merchants and sailors, became a battleground. The city's last defenders fell one by one. Blood stained the stones, the waters of the harbour, turning dark with it. When the fighting ended, Tyre had fallen. Its proud walls lay broken. The sea, once its shield, now carried the smoke of ruin. Alexander entered the conquered city. The victory had come at great cost to both sides. Yet in his heart, he knew the message had been sent. No city, no fortress, no island would stand against the will of the Macedonian king. The island that would not bow had been brought to its knees. Chapter 11: Faith and the Cross. Long before the sound of church bells reached the cold northern shores, the Vikings looked to other powers. Their world was one where gods walked unseen among the forests and mountains, where spirits stirred in, the sea and the storm. The Norse pantheon was vast and alive, woven into the rhythms of daily life. At its heart stood Odin, the All-Father, god of wisdom, war, and death. He hung from the great tree Yggdrasil to gain knowledge of the runes, sacrificing himself to himself. One-eyed and wandering, he sought secrets in the shadows of the world. Warriors looked to him for victory, kings for guidance, poets for inspiration. Thor, the thunderer, ruled the skies. His hammer, Mjolnir, cracked the heavens with each strike, protecting gods and mortals alike from the forces of chaos. Farmers and sailors prayed to Thor for safety, for fair weather and fertile land. His image hung in homes, worn as amulets, around necks carved into ships. Freya, goddess of love, beauty, and battle, embodied life's dualities. She wept tears of gold for her lost husband, yet led the Valkyries in gathering fallen warriors to her own hall. Women invoked her for matters of the heart and hearth, warriors for courage and honor, yet the gods were not distant. They were present, in the rustling of leaves, the crash of waves, the flicker of firelight. Sacred groves, springs, and stones served as their altars, Offerings of food, weapons, and animals were left beneath ancient trees or cast into the depths of still waters. Before battle, warriors marked themselves with prayers to Odin or Thor. Families gathered at seasonal festivals to honor Freya, the god of fertility and harvest. Life and death were guided by ritual. At birth, children were sprinkled with water and named beneath the gaze of the gods. At death, their bodies were laid with grave goods for the journey to the afterlife, perhaps to Odin's Valhalla, or to the quieter realms of hell. The old faith was rich and varied. It explained the shifting seasons, the storms at sea, the flickering northern lights. It gave purpose to suffering and joy to celebration. Above all, it bound the Norse people to their land, their ancestors, and each other. This was the world into which the Vikings were born, a world of gods and spirits, as close as the wind and as eternal as the stars. Encounters with the cross, as Viking ships spread across Europe, their warriors did not return only with silver and slaves. They brought stories of strange buildings filled with singing, of men in robes who prayed to a single god, of books filled with mysteries. Through sword and curiosity alike, the Vikings encountered the faith of the cross. At first, the clash was violent. Monasteries along the coasts of England, Ireland, and France were among the earliest targets of Viking raids. The wealth they held was tempting, but so too was the foreignness of the Christian faith. Crosses of gold, illuminated manuscripts, and relics spoke of a different power, one not forged in battle, but in belief. To many Vikings, Christianity seemed a puzzle. Why worship a god who suffered and died? Why shun the old gods who had stood by their ancestors? Yet fascination stirred beneath scorn. The written word intrigued them, as did the vast networks of Christian trade and alliance. Some Vikings dismissed the faith entirely. Others viewed it as one more force to respect or to exploit. Yet as the years passed, exposure deepened. Captives brought to the north often remained Christians, practicing their faith quietly. Missionaries followed the raiders home, seeking to convert their captors with patience and persuasion. Through marriage, trade, and diplomacy, the threads of Christian belief wove slowly into Norse life. A Christian bride might bring her faith into a pagan household. A Viking merchant trading with Christian lands might adopt certain customs to ease negotiations. Still, resistance was strong. Many feared losing the gods who had guided them. Some mocked the cross openly. Yet beneath the surface, change had begun. The seeds of a new faith were sown, carried on the same winds that bore the dragon-proud ships across the sea. Kings who converted. As Viking society evolved, so too did its leadership. Chieftains became kings. Small realms sought stability in an ever-changing world. And with this shift came a new calculation. Faith could serve politics as well as the soul. Across Scandinavia, rulers began to see conversion to Christianity as a means to peace and power. Embracing the cross opened doors to alliances with powerful Christian kingdoms. It brought trade privileges and the promise of stability in an age weary of endless raids and retaliation. The process was gradual and rarely simple. Kings might accept baptism publicly, yet privately honor the old gods. Others imposed the new faith with force, destroying pagan shrines and outlawing sacrifices. In many cases, the conversion of a king marked only the beginning of a long and uneven journey for his people. Harald Bluetooth of Denmark was among the first notable converts. His rune stone at Jelling proclaims his role in bringing Christianity to the Danes, yet also honors his lineage and deeds in traditional style. The stone itself bears both Christian cross and pagan imagery, a symbol of transition. In Norway, Olaf Tryggvason, and later Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, used both persuasion and violence to Christianize the land. Churches rose where sacred groves had stood. Yet resistance persisted, especially in remote regions where the old faith clung like moss to stone. In Sweden, conversion was slower still. The temple at Uppsala remained a center of pagan worship well into the 11th century. Kings walked a careful path, balancing old loyalties with new ambitions. For the Vikings, conversion was rarely a matter of sudden belief. It was a complex dance, part faith, part politics, part survival. The cross rose where Thor's hammer once hung, but the change beneath the surface moved in its own time. A blended faith. For generations, old and new beliefs coexisted. The Norse were pragmatic. They honored the gods of their ancestors while cautiously embracing the promises of the Christian faith. In this liminal space, a blended spiritual world emerged. Runestones from this era tell the story. Some bear crosses, alongside images of serpents and dragons, symbols of older myths. Inscriptions invoke both Christ and Odin's wisdom. Burial practices too reflected this blend. Christian graves might still include grave goods, a nod to older customs of provisioning the dead. Festivals adapted rather than vanished. Yule, once a pagan winter feast honoring the rebirth of the sun, merged with Christmas celebrations. Sacred sites were reimagined. Churches rose atop ancient mounds, their bells ringing where once fires had burned for Freya and Thor. Rituals intertwined. A Christian might wear a cross and a Mjolnir pendant side by side. Families hedged their spiritual bets, praying at church on Sunday, yet making quiet offerings to the land spirits for a good harvest. This syncretism reflected a deep truth. Cultural change rarely moves in straight lines. The old ways faded slowly, woven into the fabric of the new. Memory lingered in song and story, in the quiet rituals of the hearth. By the 12th century, the Christianization of the Norse world was largely complete. Yet traces of the pagan past remained. The sagas preserved, the deeds of gods and heroes. Folklore kept alive the spirits of forest and sea. Even in belief, the Viking spirit endured. Adaptable, resilient, and deeply connected to the land. The dance between the old gods and the cross shaped not only Viking faith, but their legacy. It taught them to navigate change with both reverence and pragmatism. And it ensured that, though the Viking Age would end, its echoes would live on, in stone, in story, and in the hearts of those who remember. Chapter 12. The Heart of the Empire. There are moments in history when the march of an army feels less like war and more like fate. So it was when Alexander approached the gates of Babylon, the fabled heart of Mesopotamia, the city of kings and legends. Word had already reached its people. The Persian armies were broken. Darius had fled once more. And the Macedonian king, whose name now stirred both fear and wonder, was coming. Babylon, mighty and ancient, did not resist. Its leaders knew that walls would not save them now. Instead, they chose a different path. As Alexander neared the city, emissaries came bearing olive branches and keys. They bowed low, offering peace and welcome. The gates of the city, massive and adorned with golden reliefs, swung open without a fight. The Macedonian army entered in triumph. Yet it was no scene of plunder or rage. Alexander wished to be seen not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. He walked beneath the towering arches of the Ishtar Gate, its glazed blue tiles shimmering like the sky itself. Crowds lined the streets, watching in awe as the young conqueror passed. In the heart of the city, Alexander made offerings at the great temple of Marduk, honoring the gods of the land. His respect for the ancient traditions of Babylon won him favor among its priests and people. Here was a king who sought not to erase the past, but to stand within its long shadow. For days, Alexander remained in Babylon. The city's wealth was legendary. Its markets filled with goods from across the known world. Its scholars preserved the wisdom of ages. Its walls held stories older than memory. And now, all of it lay within his grasp. Yet Alexander's gaze was already turning eastward. Babylon was a jewel, but not the prize he sought. Beyond it lay Susa, Persepolis, the true seats of Persian power. The heart of the empire still beat, and he would not rest until he held it in his hands. Susa's treasure rooms. The road to Susa was long, but unopposed. Darius, still fleeing, left no army to stand in Alexander's path. And so the Macedonian host moved steadily onward, deeper into lands once thought invulnerable. Susa, another ancient capital, awaited them. Here, the wealth of Persia had been gathered for generations. Gold beyond counting, silks woven with the skill of master hands, gems that sparkled with the light of stars, lapis lazuli, deep as the night sky from the mountains of the east. When Alexander entered Susa, the city too surrendered without resistance. Its governors and nobles knelt before him. The great treasure rooms were opened. What lay within surpassed all expectation, chests overflowing with coin and bullion, statues and vessels of pure gold, robes of unparalleled richness, works of art crafted by hands long turned to dust, the wealth of ages stored beneath vaulted ceilings. For days, the Macedonians counted, sorted, marveled. Alexander watched with a cool gaze. He had conquered for more than riches, yet even he could not help but wonder at the river of treasure, now flowing through his hands. Among the spoils, there were more than material prizes. Royal archives revealed the intricate workings of the Persian state. Scrolls and tablets held the knowledge of astronomers, healers, and builders. Alexander ordered that these be preserved, studied, valued. Yet even as the gold of Susa filled his coffers, another thought burned brighter. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian kings, still stood. To take it would be to strike at the very soul of the empire. And in Alexander's heart, a hunger grew, not just for land, not just for gold, but for an act that would echo through time. The fire at Persepolis. Persepolis was a city of stone and dream. Built upon a terrace above the plain, it rose like a vision, columns towering against the sky, palaces adorned with carvings of tribute and triumph. For generations, the Persian kings had ruled from here, holding court beneath its mighty roofs. When Alexander arrived, the city too opened its gates. There was no army left to defend it. Darius had fled east once more, his empire crumbling behind him. At first, Alexander treated Persepolis with care. He entered the royal palace, marveled at its beauty, and accepted the surrender of its nobles. The Macedonian soldiers, weary and eager, were granted the spoils of conquest. Gold and silver poured from the vaults. Art and treasure changed hands. But beneath the surface of victory, something darker stirred. Some say it was vengeance. The memory of the Persian invasion of Greece still burned in Macedonian hearts. Cities had been razed. Temples had been desecrated. Now, with the enemy's heart laid bare, many called for retribution. Others speak of a night of drunken revelry. A great feast was held in Persepolis. Wine flowed freely. Dancers moved through the halls. In the glow of torchlight, the line between celebration and fury blurred. Amid the revelry, it is said, a bold voice called out that the palace of the Persian kings should be burned, that the ghost of past wrongs demanded it. Whether it was Alexander himself who gave the order, or whether he was caught in the moment, history does not agree. But the torches were lit. Flames leapt to the rafters. Curtains and tapestries ignited in waves of heat. The great cedar beams groaned and collapsed. Stone cracked beneath the fury of the fire. Alexander, it is said, watched in silence as the palace burned. The wind carried sparks high into the night. The heart of an empire turned to ash before his eyes, ashes and aftermath. By dawn, Persepolis was scarred beyond recognition. The grand halls of the kings lay in ruin. Blackened columns stood amid heaps of rubble. The scent of smoke lingered in the air, heavy and bitter. The Macedonian soldiers moved through streets lined with ash. Some still celebrated, their thirst for vengeance sated. Others looked upon the ruins with unease, sensing that something had been lost beyond stone and gold. And Alexander? For a time, he remained apart. Alone among the ruins, he walked the blackened stones. The fire had claimed more than the palace of kings. In its glow, something within him had shifted. It is said that he later regretted the act, that the flames had not brought the closure he sought, that the destruction of Persepolis was a wound upon his own soul. For here, at the height of his triumph, a question began to take root. What did conquest mean if it left only ashes behind? What legacy was worth building if it must be built upon ruin? The fire had consumed Persepolis, but it had also kindled a deeper uncertainty in Alexander's heart, one that would follow him quietly as he pressed ever eastward toward lands yet unconquered, toward a destiny still unwritten. Chapter 13. The Ghost of Darius. The sun rose over an empire in retreat. After the fall of Persepolis, after the flames had licked the stones of kings, there was no longer a heart for Persia to beat from. But still, a shadow moved across the east. Darius, the great king, now a king without a court, without an army, without the weight of command. He fled through the deserts and mountains of his once mighty land, and behind him came Alexander. But this was no chase driven by hatred. Alexander did not seek to crush a rival. He pursued Darius because he had begun to see the Persian crown as his own, and a crown, he believed, must be taken not from a corpse left in the dust, but from the living hand of its last true bearer. The pursuit was a race for legitimacy, not slaughter. The trail wound ever eastward, across the burning plains where the earth shimmered beneath a molten sky, through passes where narrow stone walls rose like the ribs of giants. In each town, each camp, Alexander's scouts gathered whispers of a royal caravan that travelled in haste, growing smaller with each passing league. The king, who had once commanded the armies of the world, now moved like a hunted stag. Few remained loyal. The once loyal had grown restless. Among them, satraps and generals began to see Darius not as their sovereign, but as a burden to be cast aside. Alexander's army pressed on. They crossed great rivers, forced their way through deep snows in mountain passes. They endured winds that stripped the skin from faces, deserts where even the camels staggered beneath the sun. The soldiers marched not for plunder or battle, but for a strange, solemn prize, the body of an empire, still breathing. Days turned to weeks. The pursuit grew personal. Alexander rode at the front, sleeping little, urging his men onward. He dreamed, not of crushing Darius beneath his spear, but of meeting him face to face, to offer terms, to take the kingship with honor. Yet each dawn, the king remained just beyond reach, slipping further into the eastern wilds. The chase crossed into lands where Persian power no longer reached. Villages closed their gates. The roads dissolved into animal tracks and shifting sands, but Alexander would not turn back. Something deeper than strategy drove him now. A sense that the final moment of this long war could not be written in battle, but in a meeting of eyes. The final camp. At last, the whispers grew louder. In the land of Bactria, high among cold valleys and lonely passes, the great king's caravan had stopped. But it was not a planned camp. It was a place of betrayal. As Alexander's scouts crept near, they learned the truth. Bessus, a trusted, noble and relative of Darius, had turned traitor. Seeing that escape was hopeless, that Alexander's army would soon overtake them, Bessus and a band of conspirators had struck. They seized the king, bound him, and sought to carry him deeper, into the wilderness as a hostage. But when even that proved impossible, they chose a darker path. In a makeshift camp abandoned by fear, they left Darius bleeding in the dust. The great king, wounded and alone, was no longer a prize worth carrying. Alexander arrived hours later. The air was thin and cold. The royal tent stood empty. The campfires had long burned out. Silence hung like a shroud. Then, a voice, a soldier's shout. In a shallow ravine beyond the camp, beneath a tattered cloak, the body of Darius was found. But he was not yet dead. Alexander dismounted and strode through the hush of his men. No guards, no ceremony, only the soft crunch of boots on frost-hardened earth. He approached the wounded king. There, amid the stones and dust, Darius lay. Blood stained his garments. His breaths were shallow, his gaze flickering between worlds. Yet even in this broken moment, there was a trace of regal bearing in the way he held himself. A king facing the end. Alexander knelt. He took Darius's hand. No words passed between them that history remembers. No grand speech, just a shared, heavy silence. One king kneeling before another, as life faded with the setting sun, covered in a cloak. There is a moment in every life when action must speak louder than legacy. As Alexander looked upon Darius, that moment came. He did not call for physicians. It was too late. He did not summon guards or scribes. Instead, with simple reverence, he removed his own royal cloak and draped it over the dying king. The fabric, rich with the colors of Macedon and newly claimed Persia, settled across Darius's shoulders. It was not an act of conquest. It was an act of honor. One ruler recognizing the dignity of another in his final breath. Around them, the soldiers stood. Still, the wind whispered through the valley. No sword was drawn. No shout of triumph echoed in the hills. The war that had reshaped the known world ended not with a clash of arms, but with a gesture of respect between two weary men. In that moment, Alexander's victory was complete. Not by seizing the throne in battle, but by kneeling in humility before the last bearer of the Persian crown. A man who had been an enemy, a rival, a figure chased across a vanishing empire, now a fellow king whose life slipped quietly into legend beneath a stranger's cloak. And as Darius's eyes closed, Alexander remained kneeling. The final breath of the Achaemenid Empire passed into the cold air. No trumpet sounded, no victory cry rose, only silence, deep and unbroken. The crown without a battle. The death of Darius rippled outward like a stone cast into still water. In the days that followed, news spread through the lands of Persia and beyond. The great king was dead. The empire he had once ruled was now a body without a soul. But Alexander did not seize the throne in the way of conquerors past. He did not place the Persian crown upon his own head in a hall of fire and gold. Instead, he moved with careful purpose. He ordered that Darius be buried with full royal honors. The fallen king was laid to rest among his ancestors in the tradition of Persia's mightiest rulers. Alexander himself attended the rites, standing not as an enemy, but as a successor, paying tribute to the past. To the Persian nobles who remained, Alexander spoke with measured words. He did not claim to destroy their empire. He claimed to continue it. He promised to honor their customs, to respect their gods, to lead as a true king, not as a foreign invader. In doing so, Alexander became more than a conqueror. He became the living embodiment of two worlds, Greek and Persian, West and East, the old and the new. The throne was no longer a prize to be taken by force. It had been passed quietly from a dying king to a young one who knelt in the dust. And in that solemn moment, a new chapter of history began. The war had ended not with the roar of armies, but with a whisper. A simple gesture beneath a cold sky. The world turned, and Alexander, with the weight of two empires upon his shoulders, prepared to write the next lines of his story. Chapter 14. The Mountains of Rebellion. There are places where the land itself becomes a wall, where mountains rise so high that they seem to tear the sky, where stone and snow swallow armies whole. Beyond the soft valleys of Persia, beyond the palaces and temples of kings, Alexander now faced such a land. Here lay Bactria and Sogdiana, eastern provinces of the Persian world. But these lands were no longer ruled by the great king. They were ruled by the mountains and by the proud peoples who had always lived among them. Alexander had claimed the Persian Empire, but an empire on parchment was not yet an empire in truth. In these remote places, loyalty to Darius had faded, but submission to Alexander had not begun. The satraps and nobles here looked to the ridges and peaks for safety, not to any throne. Many had fled into the highlands, gathering warriors, fortifying stone-walled villages, and preparing to resist. To march into these lands was to enter another kind of war, one fought not on open plains, but along narrow paths, where a single stone could bring death, where an avalanche could scatter an army, where every ridge could hide 100 archers. And yet Alexander would not be turned aside. The mountains that loomed before him were not barriers. They were a challenge. He drove his army forward, climbing roads no army had taken before. Men grew weary beneath heavy packs. Horses stumbled along icy trails. The cold gnawed at bone and spirit. Still, they pressed on. The people of Bactria and Sogdiana fought with a fierce pride. Their fortresses clung to cliffs like nests of eagles. Their warriors knew the land's every fold and hollow. Here, conquest was slow and brutal. Each village taken was a prize hard won. Each step forward was paid for in blood and days. But Alexander's resolve only deepened. He would not leave an unconquered land behind him. To rule an empire, he must rule all of it, even the mountains that touched the clouds. And so the long campaign began, upward and onward, into a world where even the gods seemed distant. Men with wings. Among the many strongholds that dared resist, one rose above the rest, a fortress perched upon a sheer cliff in Sogdiana. Its walls were of stone, its defenders fierce, but its greatest defense was the mountain itself. The cliffs below it fell away like the face of the world. No road reached it. No siege tower could be built upon its slopes. From the heights, the defenders mocked Alexander's army below. "No force on earth," they shouted, "can climb to us. Only men with wings could take this place." For days, Alexander studied the fortress. His generals urged patience. Some advised bypassing it altogether. But the king had made a habit of turning the impossible into the inevitable. He called for volunteers, the strongest, the boldest climbers in the army. From across the ranks, men stepped forward. They gathered ropes, iron spikes, and sheer determination. On a cold and moonless night, they began to climb. No trumpets sounded, no torches flared. In silence, by starlight alone, the men crept upward. They drove spikes into the stone, tied ropes from ledge to ledge, inching toward the sky. The climb was treacherous. The mountain showed no mercy. 30 men fell to their deaths, swallowed by the dark. But the others climbed on, hands bloodied, bodies shaking with exhaustion, hearts fixed on the summit. By dawn, they reached the top. There they stood, men without wings, but with a will that had defied the impossible. Alexander sent a herald beneath the walls. "Look to your heights," he called. The defenders looked up and saw the climbers, weapons drawn, banners unfurled. The message was clear. No place was beyond Alexander's reach. The fortress surrendered. Roxana's hand. As the mountains bent beneath the will of his army, Alexander faced another path. One not of stone and ice, but of hearts and bloodlines. Among the noble families of Bactria was a young woman named Roxana. Her father, a respected lord, had been among those who fought to resist. But now, as the Macedonian tide swept through the land, new alliances were needed. Yet this was not merely a political choice for Alexander. When he met Roxana, it is said, he was struck by her beauty and spirit. She was no pawn, no prize to be claimed without thought. In her, he saw a bridge between the worlds he sought to unite. The marriage that followed was more than a union of two people. It was a symbol, a binding of East and West, of conqueror and conquered, of ancient bloodlines and new ambitions. In the high halls of Bactria, under the gaze of both Macedonian and Persian nobles, the wedding took place. There were no great fanfares, no processions through the streets, but the meaning was clear to all. By taking Roxana's hand, Alexander showed that he sought not only to conquer, but to belong. The mountains might be taken by force, but hearts could only be won with respect. The union eased tensions in the region. Many who had fought now looked upon Alexander with new eyes. A king who married into their blood would not so easily be dismissed as a foreign oppressor. Yet even as this new bond was forged, the campaign was not done. Winter was coming, and the mountains had not yet yielded all their secrets. Winter among the stones. The snows came early that year. Heavy and thick, they cloaked the peaks in silence. Roads vanished beneath drifts. Rivers froze in place. The sun itself seemed a pale ghost, unable to warm the land. For Alexander and his men, winter among the stones was a trial unlike any before. The mountains that had challenged their strength now tested their endurance. Food grew scarce. fires burned low. Tents sagged beneath the weight of ice. In the narrow passes, winds howled like wolves. Men huddled together for warmth, their breath rising in pale clouds. Even the gods seemed far away now. The stars above, once guides to the traveler, now watched in cold indifference. But Alexander did not falter. Each day, he moved among his soldiers, walking the frozen camps, sharing their hardships, speaking words of resolve. His presence was a beacon amid the frost. Spring will come, he told them, and when it does, we will finish what we began. And so they waited. Days turned to weeks, snow fell without end. The world shrank to a circle of stone and ice, yet within that circle, the fire of Alexander's will burned bright. His men endured because he endured. They pressed on because he pressed on. When at last the snows began to melt, when the rivers sang again beneath the thaw, the army emerged stronger for its trials. The mountains had not broken them. And in the quiet of that long winter, something deeper had been forged. A bond of loyalty and resolve that would carry them through the battles yet to come. For in the east, the road stretched on, and Alexander, unyielding as the stone beneath his feet, was ready to walk it. Chapter 15. The divided heart. The deeper Alexander moved into the east, the more the land seemed to change him. The sun that had once risen behind Greek temples now cast its light upon Persian palaces. The voices in the streets spoke strange tongues. The customs were older, heavier with meaning. Here, kings were not men to be embraced or argued with. They were divine figures, wrapped in ceremony and untouchable dignity. And Alexander, ever a student of the worlds he conquered, began to listen. Persian robes, woven with gold thread and deep purple dyes, replaced the simpler garb of a Macedonian general. His crown, once a wreath of leaves, now gleamed with jewels. He adopted the slow, formal ways of the Persian court. He sat upon the great throne of the empire, and before him, men were now expected to bow, to perform proskynesis, the full act of obeisance due to a god-king. To the Persian nobles and courtiers, this was familiar, even comforting. It meant Alexander truly wished to be their king, not a foreign warlord passing through. To them, the ceremonies of the court were as important as its armies. But among Alexander's own men, the hardened Macedonian warriors who had marched with him from the west, unease began to grow. They had followed him through deserts and across mountains. They had fought and bled at his side. They had toasted victories as equals. Now they were asked to kneel. Now they were asked to treat their companion and general as if he were more than a man. Around the banquet tables and campfires, the murmurs spread. Some called it vanity. Others whispered of madness. They missed the young king who had led them, with a clear gaze and simple words. Now, in the gold halls of Persia, that man seemed to drift further away with each passing day. Yet Alexander saw something greater. In his vision, the empire must not remain a patchwork of conquered lands. It must become one, a place where East and West met not only in war, but in peace. And to rule such an empire, a king must be more than Macedonian. He must be something new, something greater. But the cost of that dream would soon become clear. The banquet of blood. It was a night meant for celebration. In a great hall adorned with banners and braziers, Alexander gathered his generals and friends. Wine flowed freely. The mood was loud, bright with the flush of victory and the weight of long campaigns. Among the guests was Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's most trusted men. A fierce soldier, a companion since the earliest battles, Clytus had once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River. On that day, as a Persian blade swung toward the young king, it was Clytus's arm that had struck the fatal blow and shielded his king. But on this night, old loyalties gave way to rising tensions. The wine dulled caution and loosened tongues. Clytus, proud of his Macedonian blood and wary of the eastern changes sweeping the court, spoke sharply. He mocked the Persian customs. He questioned the new robes and the bowed heads. His words cut through the air, too sharp, too loud. Alexander's face darkened. His voice rose. Words turned to shouts. The room grew still. Those close to the king tried to calm him. They urged Clytus to leave, to end the argument before it could turn dangerous. But pride and wine are stubborn companions. Clytus returned and spoke again. In a burst of rage, Alexander seized a spear. Before any could stop him, he thrust it forward. The weapon struck true. Clytus, the man who had once saved Alexander's life, fell to the floor. The silence that followed was deeper than any that had come before. The feast was forgotten. The gold of the hall seemed to dim. Grief came swiftly. In the hours that followed, Alexander was inconsolable. He wept over the body. He cursed his own hand. For all his vision of a unified world, for all his dreams of greatness, he had in that moment become a man divided against himself. Some wounds are carved in stone. Others, like this, are carved in the heart. The pages' conspiracy. But shadows did not lift with the dawn. In the halls of the court, beneath the trappings of wealth and victory, distrust began to fester. Alexander's shift toward Persian ways had widened the gulf between him and many of his old companions. Whispers moved like smoke through the ranks. Loyalty, once unshakable, now cracked beneath suspicion and fear. Among those closest to the king were the royal pages, young Macedonian nobles trained to serve and protect the monarch. They had once looked to Alexander with bright eyes, dreaming of honor and greatness. Now, some looked with bitterness. One among them, wounded by personal grievance and stirred by the discontent around him, began to plot. Others joined him there, words veiled but sharp. What began as discontent soon took shape as conspiracy. The plan was simple. A knife, a moment, an end to a king who seemed to be slipping from the man they had once known. But fortune did not favor them. The plot was uncovered before it could be carried out. The pages were seized. Under questioning, the truth came forth. When Alexander learned of the betrayal, his heart was torn once more. These were not faceless enemies. They were the sons of men who had fought beside his father. They were young men he had once laughed with and taught. Justice was swift. The conspirators were executed. Yet with each blow, trust seemed to bleed from the court. The shadows had deepened. No man's loyalty could be assumed. No heart was free from the weight of doubt. In the quiet that followed, Alexander looked inward. The robes of a king, the gold of an empire, they came at a price, and that price was beginning to show its shape. The vision of oneness. Yet even amid the darkness, the flame of Alexander's vision still burned. He dreamed of more than conquest. He dreamed of unity, a world where many peoples could live beneath. One sky, where east and west might blend, not clash. To his Persian subjects he extended respect and honors. He welcomed their customs, learned their ways. He encouraged his officers to take Eastern wives, to weave bonds of family across the divisions of empire. In ceremonies rich with meaning, he spoke of a single world, not of Greeks ruling Persians, but of one people joined in purpose. But such a vision is fragile. It must be nurtured with patience, built upon trust. And in the heart of the empire, trust was in short supply. Many of his men still longed for the simpler days, when the king was their comrade, when victory was shared without ceremony. Now they walked beneath marble arches and bowed in halls, heavy with incense. They wondered, had they won the world or lost their king? Alexander too felt the weight of change. In the quiet of night, beneath stars that knew no borders, he still dreamed. He dreamed of one empire under the stars, of a unity that could outlast swords and thrones. But the road ahead was growing harder, and the heart of the king, like the empire he now ruled, was becoming a land divided. Chapter 16. The Elephants of India. There are rivers that mark the edges of maps, and there are rivers that mark the edges of dreams. For Alexander and his men, the Hydaspes was both. Beyond it stretched the vast lands of India, a place spoken of in whispers, its kings mighty, its animals strange and fierce. To cross it would be to cross into the unknown. The river itself seemed determined to stand in their way. Fed by monsoon rains, the Hydaspes had swollen into a dark, raging current. Its banks were choked with mud and broken branches. Waves slapped against the roots of ancient trees. The sky above hung low and heavy with cloud, but beyond this wall of water stood Porus, a king of great stature and greater pride. Unlike others who had fled before Alexander's march, Porus had chosen to stand. His forces awaited on the far bank, elephants gleaming with armor, cavalry and infantry ready for war. He had no intention of yielding. Alexander, studying the scene, understood the challenge. A direct crossing by daylight would be suicide. His forces would be torn apart before they could even form ranks. He needed surprise, the most precious weapon of all. For days, Alexander performed a dance of distraction. He had his men make noisy movements along the riverbanks. Tents were raised and lowered, drums were beaten, fires were lit in plain sight. It was a show designed to convince Porus that no crossing could occur while the river raged. But far upstream, Alexander prepared in secret. He found a bend in the river, cloaked by dense woods and islands. Here, at night, under cover of a storm, he would move his best units, the companions, archers, light infantry, would make the crossing first. The rest would follow once a foothold was secured. The chosen night arrived with thunder. Rain lashed the camps. The roar of the Hydaspes grew even louder, perfect for masking the sounds of movement. In small boats, rafts of hides, even clinging to swimming horses, Alexander's men began their crossing. The current was fierce. Boats spun in the darkness. Men were swept downstream, but slowly, steadily, they reached the far bank. Soaked too, the bone shivering beneath their armor, they gathered beneath the dripping trees. Dawn was near. Surprise had been won. The hardest part still lay ahead. Alexander stood among his men, his gaze fixed toward the east. Beyond the trees, Porus's camp awaited, unaware that the storm would soon bring more than rain. Beasts of war. The first light of morning brought grim news to Porus. Alexander had crossed. A force of determined Macedonians now stood on the far side of the Hydaspes. Quickly the Indian king acted. His army moved into position, proud warriors of the Punjab, arrayed in long ranks. But at the center of his formation stood the true heart of his strength. Elephants. Not mere beasts, these were towers of war. Each elephant carried a small fortress upon its back, manned by archers and spearmen. Their thick hides were armored, their tusks had been sharpened and tipped with iron. To the Macedonians, these creatures were a new terror. Horses had never faced such opponents before. Even veteran soldiers looked upon the advancing line with unease. The earth itself seemed to shudder beneath the weight of the beasts. Porus himself rode a towering elephant, commanding the field from high above. His presence gave courage to his warriors. He was a king determined not to yield an inch of his homeland. Alexander surveyed the scene calmly. He knew the elephants would be the deciding factor. If they could be neutralized, the battle could be won. If not, disaster awaited. He ordered his cavalry to sweep wide, attacking the Indian horsemen and threatening the flanks. His archers and javelin throwers were told to target the elephants' drivers and soft spots behind the armor. But at the center, he placed his trust in the phalanx, the unbreakable wall of spear and shield that had carried him across Asia. The signal was given. The armies advanced. The elephants came first, their trumpeting cries echoing across the wet field. They charged with terrifying force, trunks swinging, tusks aimed low. The Macedonian line held its breath. Then, contact. The Iron Line. The clash was a thing of horror. The elephants crashed into the phalanx with the power of a living avalanche. Spears snapped like twigs beneath their weight. Soldiers were thrown aside, trampled underfoot. But the phalanx bent. It did not break. Veteran pikemen regrouped, bracing their shields, thrusting their long spears upward into soft underbellies. Archers poured arrows into the exposed flanks of the beasts. The drivers atop the elephants became prime targets. One by one, they were shot down, leaving their mounts wild and uncontrollable. Some elephants, enraged by wounds, turned back into their own ranks, spreading chaos among the Indian infantry. Others, maddened with pain, charged at random, creating havoc on both sides. Amid the mud and blood, the Macedonians pressed forward. The ground turned to a red mire beneath the feet of man and beast alike. Alexander himself led the cavalry assault on the Indian flanks, cutting down horsemen and driving deep into the enemy formation. His presence inspired his men to greater feats of courage. The iron line of the phalanx advanced, step by determined step. The elephants were no longer invincible. They staggered, fell, or fled. By late morning, the tide of battle had turned. The Indian infantry, seeing their center shattered and their king surrounded, began to falter. Yet Porus fought on. From atop his elephant, he rallied his remaining warriors, refusing to retreat. Even when wounded and surrounded, he remained a king, unbowed, defiant. Finally, after hours of relentless combat, the field was Alexander's. The river still roared in the distance. The field lay soaked with rain, blood, and the fallen. But the hardest battle of Alexander's life had been won as a king. When the fighting ceased, Alexander sought the captured Porus. He had fought with unmatched courage. Alexander, though victorious, felt deep respect for this proud king. Porus was brought before him, still tall despite wounds, still bearing himself as a ruler. Alexander asked simply, "How should I treat you?" Porus's reply was as swift as it was timeless. "Like a king." Alexander smiled. This was the answer of a man who knew the worth of dignity. In an act of magnanimity, Alexander restored Porus to his throne and even granted him greater lands. It was a gesture not just of mercy, but of wisdom. For in honoring Porus, Alexander secured the loyalty of the region beyond the Hydaspes. This moment, one king honoring another, stood in stark contrast to the brutality of the battle. It was a glimpse of the unity Alexander still dreamed of. One world, where greatness was honored regardless of its origin. The river would soon recede. The field would be cleared. The wounds of man and beast would begin to heal. But in the hearts of all who had stood upon that sodden ground, the memory of the elephants and the courage of a king would remain forever. And for Alexander, the victory at the Hydaspes marked both an end and a beginning. The edge of the known world had been reached. The dream of further conquest now lay in the hands of fate and in the hearts of weary men longing for home. Chapter 17. The Edge of the World. The road had been long, longer than any of them could have imagined. Behind them lay half the known world, crossed and conquered. Mountains and deserts, rivers and kingdoms, each one had fallen beneath their feet. But now, standing on the banks of the Hyphasis River, what we call the bays, something shifted. The air was heavy with more than the heat. It was heavy with the weight of too many years on the march. For nearly a decade, Alexander's army had followed him, loyal, determined, and brave. They had crossed the sands of Persia, climbed the snow-laden peaks of the Hindu Kush, and battled fierce kings in the lush valleys of India. Each step had been another thread in the grand tapestry of their conquests. But threads wear thin. The men gathered beneath the darkening sky, armor dulled, faces lined. Their once bright eyes now seemed dim, filled not with fear, but exhaustion. The heart of an army is not made of steel or stone. It is made of men, beating hearts that can only bear so much. And now those hearts were tired. Rumors had swirled. Beyond this river lay the mighty Ganges, and beyond that, more kingdoms unknown. But the thought of marching further into lands they could scarcely picture broke something inside them. The promises of glory no longer stirred them. The pull of home grew stronger than the call of conquest. It began with whispers, small, uncertain. Then voices grew louder. Hardened soldiers, veterans of every campaign, wept openly beneath the stars. They knelt before their king, not in rebellion, but in a plea. "We have given you all," they said, "but we have no more to give." In that moment, the river did not mark the edge of a land. It marked the edge of their strength. Alexander stood silent among them. He heard their words. He saw their tears. And for the first time, the great king faced a foe he could not conquer: weariness of the soul. The tent of silence night fell. The camp grew quiet. Fires burned low, casting long shadows across the earth. In the center of it all stood Alexander's tent, a place where decisions that shaped empires had been made. Yet tonight, no orders came. No lights flickered from within. The entrance remained closed. Alexander had withdrawn. Alone, he faced the storm within his heart. For 3 days, he spoke to no one. Messengers came and went, unanswered. His closest companions waited outside, their faces etched with worry. They had seen him wounded in battle, seen him rise from sickness, seen him face down the fiercest kings of the East. But this silence was different. It was deeper than any wound. Inside the tent, Alexander wrestled not with enemies, but with himself. He had led his men across the world, driven by a vision that burned brighter than the sun. To reach the ends of the earth, to unite all peoples beneath one banner. This had been his dream since youth. And now, that dream stood upon the edge of a river, held back not by swords or shields, but by weary hearts. He could force them, perhaps. He was their king. His will was strong, but he had always led by inspiring love and loyalty, not fear. If he pushed too hard now, the bonds that had carried them this far might break forever. Alone beneath the flickering lamp, he stared at the map spread before him. The Ganges, the lands beyond. It all remained just out of reach. The cost, too, grasp it might be too high. And so, he waited. 3 days passed. The camp held its breath. When at last he emerged, the men rose to their feet. He looked upon them, these soldiers who had become brothers. His voice was calm. "We will go no further," he said. In that simple sentence, a tide of relief washed through the camp. The king had listened, not to the siren call of ambition, but to the tired hearts of his men. 12 altars. The decision had been made, but Alexander was not a man to leave a chapter unfinished. He would mark this moment, not as a defeat, but as a testament. On the banks of the Hyphasis, he ordered 12 great altars to be built, one for each of the chief gods of Olympus. Massive stones were hauled from the earth, shaped and stacked by the weary hands of the soldiers. As the sun rose over the river, the altars stood tall, silent sentinels gazing eastward. They were more than stone. They were symbols, markers of how far the sons of Macedon had come. A place where the known world ended and the unknown began. Alexander moved among the altars slowly, his hand brushing the cool surface of the stone. In the carving of each, he left offerings, gifts to the gods, tokens of gratitude and farewell. There was no ceremony, no grand speeches. The men gathered in quiet circles, their faces turned toward the rising sun. They understood the meaning of this act. It was a way to say goodbye to the lands they would never see, to the dreams left beyond the river. For Alexander, it was a moment of deep reflection. His eyes lingered on the horizon, where mist rose above distant trees. He would always wonder what lay beyond, but sometimes greatness lies not in pressing forward, but in knowing when to stop. The 12 altars stood as the king's final gesture to the east, a line drawn not in conquest, but in reverence. The edge of the world had been reached. Now, a different journey awaited. The long turn. Turning westward, the army began its long march home. Yet the path ahead felt stranger than any they had known. They had set out from Macedon as conquerors. Now they returned as something else, older, wearier, changed. The road was hard. The monsoons came, turning paths to rivers of mud. Disease struck. Supplies ran thin. Alexander led them with the same fierce resolve, but even he could not turn back time. Each step west felt heavier than the last. The soldiers spoke often of home, of fields of wheat beneath clear skies, of the sea breeze upon their faces. Yet home, too, had become a distant dream. After so many years, what would await them there? Would they still belong to the world they had left behind? Alexander, though outwardly strong, carried a quiet sorrow. The fire of conquest had not dimmed in his heart, but the march westward forced him to face truths no sword could cut through. Dreams have limits. Even the greatest king must bow to time. He spent long hours riding alone, eyes scanning the lands they passed. Each village, each river, each face held stories he would never fully know. The tapestry of the East remained unfinished, a part of his soul forever drawn to it. But for now, his duty was clear: to bring his men home. They had followed him beyond the world they knew. Now, he would lead them back. Step by step, the great army moved westward, shadows growing long behind them, and as they marched, the altars by the Hyphasis stood silent in the east, monuments to a king's vision and to the weary hearts that shaped its end. Chapter 18. The Dream That Died in Babylon. The road home was not a return to stillness. When Alexander re-entered Babylon in the spring of 323 BC, the city did not look upon him as a man grown weary, nor did he see himself that way. His eyes still burned with the fire of a vision, one not shaped by spears or swords, but by unity. His conquests had stretched farther than any before him, yet now the young king sought to weave what he had taken into one great tapestry. The streets of Babylon were alive with color. Markets bustled, towers gleamed beneath the warm sun, and the scent of foreign spices drifted through the air. Soldiers from every corner of his empire walked the same roads: Greeks, Macedonians, Persians, Egyptians, and Indians. They wore different faces, spoke different tongues, yet they stood beneath the same banner. Alexander knew that a land conquered was not a land truly held unless its peoples were made one. And so, the king devised a new kind of campaign, a campaign of the heart. If his warriors and the sons and daughters of Persia could be bound together through marriage, then perhaps old rivalries would fade and a new world would be born. In the great hall of Babylon, beneath hanging gardens and pillars, wrapped in woven silk, a mass wedding was arranged. The occasion was not mere ceremony, it was a bold symbol of Alexander's vision. Alexander himself took 2 Persian brides, Statera, the daughter of the defeated king Darius, and Parysatis, daughter of Artaxerxes. Around him, nearly 100 of his officers followed suit, pledging themselves to noble Persian women. It was a moment that shimmered with possibility. As music filled the air and garlands of flowers hung from every archway, the mingling of Macedonian and Persian guests offered a rare glimpse of harmony. For a time, swords were set aside. Cups were raised not to victories of war, but to the fragile hope of peace. Yet beneath the joy, an unease stirred. Many of Alexander's soldiers, weary of years spent far from home, viewed the weddings with suspicion. Their loyalty had been forged through battle, not through alliances of blood. To some, the king seemed to drift further from his own people, embracing too eagerly the customs of the East. Alexander saw beyond such fears. His gaze remained fixed on a world that could yet be united, not through conquest alone, but through understanding. This was the new campaign he longed to lead, yet fate, silent and unseen, had already begun to shape another path. The falling star. In the weeks that followed the weddings, Babylon swelled with preparations. Alexander's mind turned once more to the maps that had guided his hand since boyhood. His next dream lay beyond the edge of those maps, an expedition into Arabia, a new frontier to explore and claim. But as plans unfolded beneath the vaulted ceilings of the palace, a shadow moved through the bright halls. At first, it was nothing. A restlessness, a touch of heat. The king, ever tireless, paid little heed. His mind was filled with visions yet to be realized. Then came the fever. It struck without warning. One morning, Alexander rose, weak and flushed. His body trembled beneath the weight of an unseen enemy. The king, who had faced storms, mountains, and the fiercest warriors, now battled something no sword could vanquish. Doctors were summoned from across the empire, physicians steeped in the arts of both East and West. They brought herbs and potions, whispered prayers to the gods. Yet the fever did not break. It gripped him tighter with each passing day. In his chamber, beneath rich tapestries and the gaze of solemn attendants, Alexander lay motionless, his once clear eyes clouded. The voice that had commanded armies now fell to a faint whisper. Word spread quickly through the palace and then the city. Soldiers gathered in hushed circles. Priests lit candles in every temple. The air in Babylon grew heavy with dread. For nearly 2 weeks, the fever raged. Each sunrise found the king weaker. The great conqueror, who had ridden at the front of every charge, could now scarcely lift his head. His closest companions kept vigil by his side: Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus. Hephaestion's empty place, a silent wound among them. They spoke softly, unwilling to believe what the flickering light seemed to show, that the star of their age might soon fall. Even in fevered dreams, Alexander's mind did not rest. Witnesses spoke of him, murmuring words of distant lands, of ships upon untraveled seas. The dream had not dimmed within him, but the body that carried it was fading fast. To the strongest. As the fever reached its cruel peak, it became clear that time was slipping away. The palace was filled with silence, broken only by the soft footfalls of those tending the king. On one final day, the generals, desperate and grieving, gathered at his bedside. They had shared the triumphs of every campaign, the perils of every road. Now they stood helpless as their leader. Their brother in arms hovered between life and death. Summoning the last of his strength, Alexander opened his eyes. The generals leaned close, their faces pale. A question hung in the air, spoken by one among them, though all wished to ask it. "To whom do you leave your empire?" The answer came not in a shout, nor in the confident tone they had known so well. It came as a faint breath, a whisper carried upon trembling lips. "To the strongest." The words hung heavy in the chamber. There was no name, no chosen heir, only a challenge and a warning. The vast empire, carved by his will, would not pass easily into new hands. It would be a prize fought for, a legacy as fragile as the man, now slipping from their grasp. Those gathered understood. The days ahead would be shaped not by the vision of a single leader, but by the ambitions of many. The unity Alexander had dreamed of might fracture beneath the weight of power. Yet in that moment, sorrow eclipsed all else. The man they had followed across the world was leaving them, not with a final triumph, but with a parting riddle. The strongest would rise. But who would that be? The light behind the veil. On the evening of June 10th, 323 BC, beneath a darkening sky in Babylon, Alexander drew his final breath. He was 32 years old. The city mourned. Soldiers who had never flinched on the battlefield wept openly. In the streets, merchants closed their stalls, and priests filled the temples with incense. The dreamer who had reshaped the world was gone. News spread like a wind through the empire. From the Nile to the Indus, from the Aegean to the mountains of Persia, the message carried a weight that no words could ease. Alexander's body, preserved in a golden coffin, would one day rest in Alexandria, but his spirit was already beyond the reach of kings. In the hearts of those who had followed him, and in the lands he had touched, his story had become legend. Yet the empire he left behind could not hold itself together. Without his guiding hand, the fragile unity he had forged soon unraveled. Generals carved out their own kingdoms. His dream of a single world faded into the chaos of succession. And yet, even in that breaking, something remained, a light behind the veil of history. In the centuries that followed, tales of Alexander grew, shaped by poets, scholars, and travelers. He became more than a man. He became a symbol of ambition, courage, and vision. His name crossed borders as easily as his armies once had. Empires rose and fell, but the story of Alexander endured. The dream that had burned within him did not die in Babylon. It lived on in the stories whispered beneath starlit skies, in the hearts of those who still dared to imagine what lay beyond the edge of the map. As the winds of time swept through the empty halls of Babylon, one truth remained: some lights never fade.